Greetings, fellow fans. You're tuned into Aura Fiction presenting to you today. What if Harry was a natural Wandless caster at age 4 and mastered every spell before receiving his Hogwarts letter? Show some love by liking and subscribing. Enjoy the story ahead. Chapter 1: The Boy in the Garden. The first time Harry Potter moved something without touching it, he was 4 years old and angry about a biscuit. Not even a whole biscuit. A broken one, the kind Aunt Petunia swept the crumbs of into a small bowl and left on the kitchen floor near the cupboard door, like Harry was a dog who ought to be grateful. Dudley had gotten chocolate digestives. Harry had gotten the crumbled remains of a plain one that had clearly lost a fight with someone's elbow, and the unfairness of it sat in his chest like a hot coal. He stared at Dudley's plate. The chocolate digestive slid across the table, slow and deliberate, and dropped into Harry's hand. Harry looked at it for a long moment, then he ate it. It was very good. He didn't tell anyone. Even at 4, Harry understood, in the wordless way that children understand things adults have to be told, that telling anyone would make something bad happen. He wasn't sure what kind of bad, just bad. The kind that came with shouting in the cupboard door and not eating for a day. So he kept it to himself and thought about it instead, the way he thought about most things, quietly, in the dark, in the small space under the stairs where his cot was wedged between a broken vacuum cleaner and 3 boxes of Dudley's old toys that Dudley had forgotten he owned. He tried it again that night, reached out with whatever the hot coal feeling was and moved his pillow 2 inches to the left. It moved. Harry smiled in the dark, and that was the beginning of everything. By the time he was 5, he had worked out that the feeling wasn't really anger. Anger was just the first thing that had been strong enough to push it. The magic, which is what he privately called it because no other word fit, responded to intent. Clear, focused, specific intent. He could want something vaguely and nothing would happen, but if he thought in clean lines, I want that cup to rise 3 inches off the table and turn once, it did exactly that. No more, no less. He practiced in secret, which was easy because no one paid attention to Harry unless he was doing something wrong. Aunt Petunia watched him with a nervous, darting energy, like he was a wasp she'd trapped under a glass and hadn't decided what to do with yet. Uncle Vernon watched him the way men watch things they don't understand and have decided to hate out of principle. Dudley didn't watch him at all except when there was someone else there to impress. So Harry had long, quiet hours to himself, which he spent doing things like levitating every object in his cupboard simultaneously and learning how long he could hold them there 4 minutes by age 6, indefinitely by age 7. He learned he could generate light, a soft, hovering glow about the size of a golf ball, which solved the problem of reading in the dark, which he'd been doing by feel up until then. The reading was important. Aunt Petunia threw things away with aggressive efficiency, and one of the things she threw away was books, Dudley's school books from the previous year, boxed up and left by the bins each summer. Harry had been quietly retrieving them for as long as he could reach the bin lid. He'd read every one of Dudley's discarded school books twice, some 3 times, and the local library had a children's section he visited when Aunt Petunia dropped him at the park with a packed lunch for Dudley and instructions to stay out of trouble. Harry read everything. History, science, math, stories. He had a particular fondness for stories, the kind with magic in them, and not because they reminded him of his own secret, it was the opposite. The magic in books was always external, wands and rings and chosen bloodlines, gifts from gods or curses from witches. Harry's magic was none of those things. It was him. It lived inside his sternum like a second heartbeat, and no story he read had ever quite described that, and he found it privately amusing that he was apparently more magical than the characters in books about magic. He was 6 when he first made something out of nothing. He'd been trying to do it for weeks, not conjure in the technical sense, just manifest. He wanted a book, a specific one he'd seen in the library, but hadn't been able to check out because he didn't have a library card in his name, just the one he'd quietly borrowed from a boy at school named Marcus who'd lost his and hadn't noticed. Marcus's card wouldn't let him take out books marked for adults, and the one he wanted, a thick, battered volume called Principles of Theoretical Physics that had been reshelved incorrectly into the children's section, and which Harry had become briefly obsessed with, it was adult marked. He sat in his cupboard, thought about the book in clean lines, felt the magic warm and ready in his chest and pushed. The book appeared on his lap. Harry sat very still for a moment, then he looked up at the ceiling of his cupboard and said quietly to no one, "Huh." He read the physics book in 2 days, then he sent it back. That was also important, the sending back. Harry had worked out early that the magic wasn't just about taking or moving or making. It had a shape and the shape went both ways. He could unmake things he'd made. He could return things to where they'd been. He thought of it like water, it flowed, and if you were careless it flooded, but if you paid attention you could direct it almost anywhere. He became very good at paying attention. By 7, he was doing things he had no words for. He could reach out and feel the shape of a room without opening his eyes. Not quite seeing, more like knowing. a spatial awareness that extended about 30 feet in every direction when he concentrated. He could hear things that were too far away for normal hearing, though this one was inconsistent and sometimes gave him a headache. He could fix things, cracked tiles, broken toys, once a bird with a snapped wing that had fallen into the garden, by putting his hands near them and thinking very carefully about what the whole, unbroken version looked like. He healed Dudley's hamster once when it was dying and Dudley never knew. Harry didn't mind that. He'd done it for the hamster. He was 8 when he first deliberately did something to another person, not harmful. He would not, in fact, have done something harmful, not because he lacked the capability, but because hurting things on purpose made him feel sick in a way he hadn't been able to explain to himself until he was older and had the vocabulary. It felt like waste. Like pouring water on sand. The magic was alive in him and it wanted to do things, build things, reach things. It did not particularly want to break them. What he did to Dudley was this. Dudley had been cornering a younger boy called Michael at the edge of the park. The kind of slow, grinding cruelty that Dudley had inherited from Vernon the way other boys inherited eye color. And Harry had watched it for approximately 45 seconds before reaching out quietly with his magic and making the ground beneath Dudley's feet slick as ice. Dudley went down hard. Michael ran. Dudley told Aunt Petunia that Harry had pushed him, which was not technically inaccurate from a certain point of view, and Harry spent 2 days in the cupboard, which he didn't particularly mind because he'd just acquired a copy of Intermediate Astronomy, and the light from his floating golf ball was perfectly good for reading. He did not feel guilty about Dudley. He had examined the question carefully and concluded that you couldn't feel guilty about something that was correct. The summer he was 9, Harry discovered that the magic could do something he hadn't expected. It could teach him. It started with Latin. He'd found a battered English-Latin dictionary in the charity shop on Magnolia Road, bought it with the 60 pence he'd saved from finding coins in sofa cushions, and started working through it mostly out of curiosity. He'd seen Latin phrases in the physics book and wanted to know what they meant. He was good at pattern recognition, had always been, and languages were just patterns, so he moved quickly. But what he found was that when he practiced the patterns of the Latin, the grammatical structures, the way meaning built up in layers, the magic responded. It was like the language was somehow shaped to fit what the magic wanted to do. He'd speak a phrase aloud, feel the magic vibrate against it like a tuning fork, and something would happen. Light, heat, movement, sound, silence. This was, he would later understand, a very simplified version of what wizards called spell casting. But without anyone to tell him that, Harry simply thought of it as talking to the magic in its first language. He became fluent. By 10, Harry Potter could do the following things, among many others. Levitate any object up to approximately 400 pounds. Conjure fire of any temperature from a gentle warmth to something that made the air shimmer like a road in August. Call lightning from a clear sky. Though this one made him nervous and he only did it twice, both times in the woods beyond the school playing field at midnight. Create barriers of invisible force that had held against a car once when Dudley and his gang had tried to ride their bicycles over him. Disillusion himself so thoroughly that birds flew through where he was standing. Repair any broken object provided he could hold a clear picture of its undamaged state. And read a room, feel a room, in a way that meant he always knew exactly where every person in it was, what they were doing, and whether any of them were lying. That last one was useful at school. He was not the best student in his class in the official sense. He'd learned early that being conspicuously intelligent was just another version of being conspicuous, and conspicuous meant Dudley's gang or his teachers reporting back to Aunt Petunia that Harry was being peculiar. So he held himself at a careful, deliberate average, good enough not to worry anyone, quiet enough to be overlooked. Cost him nothing. He could do the work in his sleep. There was a girl called Harriet in his class who was actually the best student, and Harry had a private fondness for her because she had the same quality of concentrated focus that he associated with himself. She solved problems the way he did, thoroughly and from first principles, and she had twice gotten into screaming arguments with their maths teacher because the teacher had been wrong and Harriet had been right and had the workings to prove it. Harry admired this deeply while doing nothing of the sort himself, because Harriet's parents were both doctors and could take the teacher to task if it came to it, and Harry's only backup was a whale in a suit. The Dursleys had noticed, of course, that things were strange around Harry. Petunia more than Vernon, because Petunia had grown up knowing about the other world. Harry had understood this without understanding why he understood it for as long as he could remember. There was something in the way she looked at him that was not quite fear and not quite guilt and not quite envy, but contained elements of all three. She never said anything directly. She had learned somehow that saying anything directly caused things to go wrong in the house, cupboard doors swinging open, water pipes groaning, the television switching to a channel no one had selected. Harry had never threatened her. He didn't need to. The magic simply reacted to his moods the way a fire reacts to wind, and when he was upset or angry, the house became very loud with small disturbances. By the time he was 11, the house was very quiet, because Harry had learned to stop being upset. What he felt instead was something harder to name. He had read enough books, fiction and otherwise, to have mapped the general shape of loneliness, and he knew he had it, but it had been so long the companion that it had stopped feeling like an absence and started feeling like a feature. The way people born without a sense of smell don't miss it because they have never had it to miss. He had the magic, he had his books. He had the pale, particular satisfaction of being very good at something in a world that had no idea he was doing it. It was a small life, he was aware of that. He did not know yet that it was about to become much larger. The letter came on a Tuesday. He'd known something was going to happen for about a week before it did. The magic had been restless in a way it only got when something significant was approaching. Not a threat, exactly, more like a change in pressure, the way the air feels before a thunderstorm. He'd gotten 2 words wrong in his Latin exercises, which was unheard of, and he'd caught himself levitating things in his sleep again, which he hadn't done in 2 years. He was in the garden, nominally weeding but actually watching a beetle navigate a particularly complex piece of bark, when the owl landed on the fence post. It was a tawny owl, large and self-important, and it had a letter in its beak that it dropped into Harry's lap with the air of someone who considered delivery an indignity but was professional enough to complete it. Harry looked at the letter. The envelope was thick cream-colored paper, and his name and address were written on the front in green ink in handwriting that was somehow simultaneously formal and personal, as though someone had spent time getting it exactly right. The back was sealed with red wax and an elaborate crest. A lion, a snake, an eagle, and a badger arranged around a large letter H. Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Little Winging, Surrey. Harry read this twice. Then he looked at the owl. The owl looked back with the expression of someone waiting for a tip. They know about the cupboard, Harry said to himself as much as the owl. He turned the letter over and opened it carefully, because even now, even with all his magic, he had a bone-deep respect for physical things. You couldn't send a physical thing back to where it came from. Physical things mattered in the way that magic didn't quite, because magic was everywhere and physical things had to be made and kept. The letter said, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Headmaster, Albus Dumbledore, Order of Merlin, First Class, Grand Sork, CHF. Warlock, Supreme Mugwump, International Conft. Of Wizards, dear Mr. Potter, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Please find enclosed a list of all necessary books and equipment. Term begins on 1 September. We await your owl by no later than 31 July. Yours sincerely, Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress. Harry read through the enclosed list of books and equipment. He recognized approximately 60% of the spells referenced in the titles. He'd taught himself most of them in the abstract, without having names for them. He was mildly interested to know what names the wizarding world had attached to things he'd been doing for years. The beetle navigated off the bark and disappeared into the grass. Harry tucked the letter into his back pocket and went inside. Uncle Vernon was in the sitting room with the television turned up loud, which was his default position on weekday evenings. Aunt Petunia was in the kitchen not cooking dinner, which meant she was reading a magazine while the oven timer did the work. Harry stood in the kitchen doorway and said, I got a letter from Hogwarts. The magazine hit the floor. Petunia was on her feet so fast she knocked the kitchen chair back, and she was staring at him with that triple expression, the fear and the guilt and the envy, pulled so tight across her face it looked painful. You're not to open that, she said. Give it here, give it to me right now, Harry. I already opened it, Harry said. I got in. You cannot go, I'm going, Harry said, not loudly. He didn't need to be loud. Petunia stopped. She looked at him for a long moment and Harry watched her work through it, her categories, her certainties, the shape of what she'd told herself about him for 11 years. Something in her face shifted when she ran out of categories. Something that might have been, underneath everything else, very old and very tired. You're just like her, Petunia said finally. And Harry wasn't sure from the way she said it whether she meant it as an accusation or a confession. My mum, Harry asked. Petunia picked her magazine up off the floor, straightened the pages with unnecessary precision, and went back to the table without answering. Harry went back to his cupboard. He sat on his cot, turned his hovering light on, and thought about a school of witchcraft and wizardry. He thought about what it meant that there were enough people like him, enough people with magic, to fill an entire school, to have a whole hidden world built around it. He thought about the fact that he had spent 7 years teaching himself something that, apparently, had a curriculum. He was mildly curious about how much of the curriculum he'd already covered. He pulled out the equipment list. Standard Book of Spells Grade 1 by Miranda Goshawk. A History of Magic by Bathilda Bagshot. Magical Theory by Adalbert Waffling. And so on through to cauldrons and telescopes and dragonhide gloves. He reached into the space in the wall behind his cot's headboard, not a physical space, a magical one, a small pocket of elsewhere he'd created at age 8 and used as a library, and felt around until he touched the books he was looking for. He pulled them out. He didn't have a standard book of spells. He had something better. 3 volumes of Flamel's Compendium of Operative Charms, 15th century, badly translated from Latin but still. A complete set of 17th century wandwork manuals that he'd read for theory even though he had no wand. 2 volumes of dark arts theory from an author he'd never been able to identify since the title page was missing from both. Something called Boundaries of the Possible by a witch named Emeric Switch who turned out not to have believed in boundaries at all. And an extraordinary collection of folklore from 12 different cultures that he'd read for fun, and which had turned out to contain real spells embedded in the stories like seeds in fruit. He had also in the last year gotten hold of a copy of The Quibbler. This had been an accident. He'd picked it up thinking it was a normal magazine and then read the entire thing with increasing fascination. And 3 back issues of Transfiguration Today, which were advanced even by his standards, but which he'd worked through with the patient focus he applied to everything. The wizarding world had a curriculum. Harry had a collection. He put the books away and lay back on his cot and looked at the ceiling. A school, he thought, other people. Other people with magic who had presumably grown up differently from him, with families who knew, with histories in this world, with context he didn't have. He thought about being around people his own age for extended periods, which he had no real experience of beyond the carefully managed performance of being a normalish 11-year-old boy at a normal school. He was curious. He was also quietly something a little like nervous, which was unusual enough that he paid attention to it. He had never needed anyone, because needing things made you vulnerable and vulnerability led to the dark of the cupboard and the broken biscuit. But he had noticed in himself a low constant hum of something that wasn't quite want but was adjacent to it. The feeling he got when he fixed the bird, when he made the hamster well, when he quietly stopped Dudley from cornering someone smaller. The feeling of his magic moving toward another living thing. He thought it might be the shape of him. The shape the loneliness had made. He would be careful, he decided, about which people he let into that space. But he would not be closed. He had spent 11 years closed and he knew what that produced, competence, just competence. Which was fine and useful and deeply, profoundly insufficient. Vernon came to his door that night, the way he always did when something had upset Petunia, which was big and red-faced and radiating an anger that was partly directed at Harry and partly directed at the universe for continuing to be strange in ways he found offensive. "You're not going to any freak school," Vernon said. "I won't have it. Your aunt and I have made it perfectly clear." "Uncle Vernon," Harry said without looking up from his book, "go to bed." The magic said it with him, quiet and certain, a weight in the air like a change in barometric pressure. Vernon went to bed. Harry read for 2 more hours and then slept, and in the morning he wrote a neat, brief reply to Deputy Headmistress McGonagall accepting his place at Hogwarts, tied it to the tawny owl who had apparently decided to wait on the fence post overnight, and sent it off. The owl departed with the air of someone who was very glad to be going home. 3 days later, a woman came to the house. Harry had known she was coming 20 minutes before she arrived. He'd felt the approach of her magic the way you feel a warm front coming in, and it was considerable, serious magic, not flashy but with a density to it that reminded him of his own, that quality of being exactly what it was and not apologizing for it. He opened the door before she knocked. She was a severe-looking woman with dark hair shot through with gray, squared-off glasses and robes of dark green that were so precisely pressed they might have been architectural. She looked at him standing in the doorway with the expression of someone who had prepared for a particular kind of meeting and was quietly revising their expectations. "Mr. Potter," she said, "I'm Professor McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts." "I know," Harry said. "Come in." He took her to the kitchen. Petunia had taken Dudley to his friend Pierce's house for the day and Vernon was at work, which Harry had not arranged but was privately grateful for, and put the kettle on while she sat down and arranged her robes with the automatic precision of someone very used to being absolutely correct in all things. "I don't usually make personal visits," she said, watching him with those sharp, assessing eyes. "But we received your acceptance letter, and some of the circumstances of your case warranted clarification." "What circumstances?" Harry asked, getting mugs from the cupboard. "There have been some unusual magical readings from this address over the years," McGonagall said carefully. "The Ministry monitors unusual magical activity in Muggle households. In your case, the readings have been persistent and significant." "How significant?" "Significant enough that I'm here rather than sending a second owl." She paused. "We want to ensure that your introduction to the wizarding world goes smoothly. That you're aware of the basic structure of how things work, the laws governing, the decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery," Harry said. 17 years old before magic outside school unless in life-threatening circumstances. "I know." McGonagall was quiet for a moment. "You know the decree, I know a lot of things." He set the tea in front of her. "I've been reading." She looked at him over her glasses and he could see her recalibrating. She'd come with a prepared script. He could tell, the standard issue welcoming a Muggle-raised child's speech, and he was not the standard issue child, and she was deciding how to proceed. He liked her immediately for how quickly she made that decision. "What have you been reading?" she asked. "Whatever I could find," Harry said honestly. which was quite a lot once I worked out how to find things. How did you work that out? I conjured them, Harry said, and watched her put her tea down very carefully. You conjured books. When I couldn't get to them another way, I got better at being precise. Early on I kept getting the wrong additions. He said this as though it were a minor logistical frustration, which is what it had been. The Flamel Compendium was the worst. There are 4 different editions and the 5th one is a forgery. I accidentally got the forgery twice. McGonagall stared at him. Harry had a feeling that Professor McGonagall was not someone who stared often and that she was probably noticing this about herself. Mr. Potter, she said in a voice that was very controlled, how long have you been doing magic? Since I was 4, Harry said. Wandless mostly. The language-based stuff took me longer. Latin's not instinctive until it is, if that makes sense. But I've had a few years to practice. Wandless, she said the word like she was examining it for cracks, at 4. I moved a biscuit, Harry said. To be fair, I was very motivated. She looked at him for a long moment. Then unexpectedly the corner of her mouth moved, just slightly, just for a second. Then it was gone and she was McGonagall again, composed and precise. You'll need a wand, she said. I know Ollivander's on Diagon Alley. He paused. The fitting process is interesting. I've read about it, but I'm curious how it actually feels from the wand's perspective. Wands don't have perspectives, Mr. Potter. I'm not entirely sure that's true, Harry said politely. Another pause. McGonagall picked up her tea. I'll escort you to Diagon Alley, she said, to get your supplies, and I'll answer whatever questions you have. Properly answer them, not in the way you'd get from old books. She gave him a look that might have contained some measure of respect. It sounds as if you've had quite enough of old books for now. I like old books, Harry said. But I'd like something real to compare them to. Diagon Alley was exactly as strange as he'd expected and also completely different. The strangeness he'd expected, the hidden archway, the bustling cobblestone street, the shops selling things that would never survive a conversation with physics. What he hadn't expected was the feeling of it. The way the magic here was ambient, not just in people but in the stones, the air, the way the light moved. He'd grown up the only magical thing in his world, and stepping into Diagon Alley was like surfacing, the way the physics book had described how deep-sea creatures must feel in shallower water. Suddenly, there was more of everything. He breathed it in and felt the magic in his chest expand with something embarrassingly close to relief. He bought everything on his list. He was careful about the books. He found himself in Flourish and Blots with the school list in one hand and quietly bypassing Standard Book of Spells Grade 1 in favor of Grade 7, and spending the bulk of his book budget on 3 texts that weren't on any school list at all. An advanced Transfiguration Theory volume, a complete compendium of magical creatures, and something simply titled The Edges of Known Magic by an author who had apparently published it anonymously because they weren't sure they wanted to be associated with what they'd concluded. McGonagall noticed but said nothing, which confirmed his assessment of her. Ollivander's was the last stop, and it was the one he'd been thinking about most. The shop was narrow and dim and smelled of wood and something else, something old and alive, the same way forests smell, the way deep water does. The shelves went up to the ceiling and curved slightly toward the back, and every inch of them was stacked with narrow boxes, and every box had a wand in it, and Harry could feel them, the way he could feel a room full of people. A low, collective hum, not voices exactly but presences, 7,000 individual lights of varying brightness and color and character. Garrick Ollivander appeared from between 2 shelves with the silent precision of a man who had spent decades knowing exactly where he was in his own space. He was old and pale-eyed, and he looked at Harry with an attention that was unusual, because it wasn't the famous person attention Harry was starting to dread from everyone else in Diagon Alley who had recognized his scar. It was the attention of someone looking for something specific. Harry Potter, Ollivander said, in a voice like old paper. I wondered when I'd be seeing you. I remember your parents' wands as though I sold them yesterday. He paused. Your father, mahogany 11 inches pliable, excellent for transfiguration. Your mother, willow 10¼ inches swishy. Good for charms work, very good. His pale eyes drifted to the scar. And then, of course, there's the wand that gave you that. I know, Harry said, you 13½ inches, the Straltail hair core. Ollivander's eyebrows rose. You've done your reading. The Wandlore texts are some of the most interesting, Harry said. The theory of the core resonance, the idea that the core doesn't just conduct magic but actively shapes it, Mr. Potter, Ollivander's voice was gently interrupting, but his eyes had gone very bright. Let's see which wand chooses you, shall we? We can discuss the theory after. What followed was, from Harry's perspective, less a fitting and more a conversation. He tried 7 wands in quick succession and felt nothing from any of them, not rejection exactly, more like polite disinterest, the way you might feel about a stranger's pleasant enough book. He tried a phoenix feather wand that McGonagall, who had come in and was watching from near the door, made a small sharp sound at. He tried 2 dragon heartstrings and a unicorn hair. On the 12th wand something happened. It was holly, 11 inches, and the core was phoenix feather, and when Ollivander put it in his hand there was a sound not audible but felt, the way very low bass frequencies are felt in the chest rather than heard by the ear, and the magic in Harry's sternum lurched toward it like water toward a drain. He almost dropped the wand. "Interesting," Ollivander said very softly, "very interesting. It's the same core," Harry said, "as the one. The phoenix who gave this feather gave only one other," Ollivander said, "and I think you know what became of the wand that holds its brother." Harry held the holly wand and felt it trying to talk to him, the way Latin had tried to talk to him, the same fundamental shape of meaning beneath the surface. He could already feel what it would do, what kind of a channel it was, the particular quality of the magic it would amplify. It wanted his input, it was asking for it. He had spent 7 years being his own wand. He thought it might be nice finally to have a collaborator. "I'll take it," he said. "Of course you will," Ollivander said, and for just a moment he looked at Harry with an expression that was not quite worry but was wearing worry's coat. "Mr. Potter. May I ask, and you needn't answer if you don't wish to, how much magic have you performed without a wand?" Harry thought about how to answer that honestly and concisely. "Most of it," he said. Ollivander nodded slowly. "The wand will change things," he said. "Not weaken you, nothing could do that, not now. But it will be a new kind of conversation. Pay attention to what it wants as well as what you want." "I know how to listen," Harry said. He paid for the wand 7 galleons, which he had because McGonagall had arranged access to his vault at Gringotts, a vault he'd had no idea existed but which had turned out to be substantial enough that he'd spent a solid 2 minutes staring at it in silence before deciding he felt about money the way he felt about everything he hadn't known he was missing, interested but not overwhelmed, and stepped back into Diagon Alley. He stood in the afternoon light with his trunk of supplies and his holly wand in his pocket and felt the world rearranged slightly around him. Not worse, just different, larger. McGonagall stood beside him. She looked quietly like someone recalibrating again. "Professor," Harry said, "yes, is Hogwarts as strange as Diagon Alley?" She considered this with appropriate seriousness. "Stranger," she said, "but the good kind of strange." He nodded. That was enough. The weeks before September 1st were the quietest of his life, which was saying something. The Dursleys left him almost entirely alone. Vernon had tried once more, the morning after McGonagall's visit, to make some version of the argument that Harry wasn't going, and Harry had looked at him with the flat, patient calm that the magic gave him when he was completely certain, and Vernon had found pressing reasons to be in his study for the rest of the day. Petunia cooked his dinners without being asked. Dudley mysteriously started being very polite. Harry spent the weeks reading, practicing with the wand, which was, as Ollivander said, a conversation his magic had to learn to talk through it rather than past it, which was like learning a new accent in a language you already spoke fluently and thinking. He thought about the school, about the subjects, about the other students, 11-year-olds who had grown up in the magical world, who had context he didn't, who would know things he didn't know. He thought about what he wanted from this, which wasn't something he'd ever had the luxury of considering before. He wanted, he decided, to learn the things he couldn't learn alone. There were whole categories of magic that required another person, collaborative work, mind arts, certain kinds of warding. And there was the other thing, the thing that lived in the same space as the magic and wanted the same things. He wanted people who could stand next to him. People who would not flinch at what he was because they were something too. It was not a very ambitious want. But it was honest. On August 31st, he packed his trunk, shrank it to the size of a matchbox with an absent flick of his wrist, and put it in his jacket pocket. He took his wand from the desk where he'd laid it the night before. He looked around the cupboard under the stairs for the last time, his cot, his stolen library space behind the wall, his hovering light still on because he'd forgotten to extinguish it, and felt something that was not quite nostalgia and not quite grief and not quite relief. Gratitude, maybe. For the years and the dark and the books and the silence and the magic that had been his only company and his best teacher. He had grown up strange and alone, and it had made him exactly what he was, and he was not sorry for any of it. He extinguished his light. He walked out of the cupboard, through the hall, and out the front door of 4 Privet Drive into the morning sunlight. He did not look back. The cab to King's Cross was driven by a man named Dave who had opinions about the football and didn't expect Harry to share them, which was ideal. Harry sat in the back seat with his holly wand in his pocket and the invisible weight of 7 years of self-education at his back and watched London go by. At King's Cross, he found platform 9.5 exactly where the text had said it would be, between platforms 9 and 10, the brick wall. And you walked through it like it was air, which it was if you believed correctly. Harry walked through it without hesitation or ceremony, and stood on the other side in a rush of steam and noise and magic. The Hogwarts Express was scarlet and glorious and enormous. The platform was chaos, children and parents and owls and cats and parcels and trunks, and the magic of it all blending and swirling in the air until it felt like breathing something heady. He stood for a moment just taking it in, all these people who had grown up in this world he hadn't known about, and for a moment the loneliness did something slightly different. It sat up straighter, alert. He found an empty compartment and sat in it and put his feet up on the opposite bench and pulled out the edges of known magic and started reading. The train began to move at 11 precisely. Halfway to Scotland, a boy with red hair knocked on his compartment door, stuck his head in and said, "All right if I sit here." "Everywhere else is full." Harry looked at him over the top of his book. Cheerful face, slightly freckled, robes that were clean but old. The kind of old that wasn't careless, just used. "Sure," Harry said and moved his feet. The boy came in and sat down, and then a moment later a girl appeared in the corridor, hair large and emphatic, holding a toad and looking somewhat frazzled. She looked into the compartment. "Sorry, has anyone seen a toad? A boy named Neville's lost one." "No," the red-haired boy said. "No," Harry said then. "Wait." He closed his eyes, reached out with his sense of room, broader than a room now, wide enough to cover a section of the moving train, and found the toad 3 compartments forward, sitting on a seat, apparently unconcerned. 3 compartments forward, Harry said. "Left-hand bench near the window." The girl stared at him. "How did you?" "I have very good hearing," Harry said. This was not true, but it was simpler. The girl gave him a long, assessing look that he found immediately interesting. It was the look of someone who was filing him away for further investigation, which was exactly what he would have done in her position. Then she left. "How did you actually do that?" the red-haired boy asked. "Magic," Harry said. "Yeah, obviously, but—" "Harry Potter," Harry said and offered his hand. The boy's eyes went to the scar and then back to Harry's face, and he only paused for a second, which was, Harry thought, pretty good for an 11-year-old who'd probably grown up hearing about him. "Ron Weasley," the boy said and shook it. Harry smiled. His first real one in a while, not the careful, controlled curve he used for teachers and Dursleys, but the actual one, the one that reached his eyes. "Tell me about Hogwarts," Harry said, leaning back. "What do people actually know about it versus what's in the books?" Ron blinked, then grinned and started talking, and outside the window Scotland came toward them, green and gray and full of things Harry hadn't learned yet. He settled into the seat and listened, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, the listening felt like something that might become a conversation. The train moved north, and Harry Potter, who had spent 11 years becoming something extraordinary in the dark, was about to step into the light. He was quietly ready. Chapter 2. The sorting of something else. The train pulled into Hogsmeade Station at dusk, and the castle appeared through the window like something that had always been there, waiting for everyone to catch up to it. Harry had read descriptions of Hogwarts, 3 of them in fact from 3 different sources, each one more florid than the last. None of them had gotten it right, which he supposed made sense. There were things you couldn't describe because describing them required you to have a word for something that had never needed a word before. Hogwarts wasn't a building in the way that buildings were buildings. It was a fact. It sat on its promontory above the Black Lake with the settled, immovable certainty of a mountain, towers and battlements against the darkening sky, windows lit amber and gold, and the magic of it was so old and dense that Harry could feel it from across the water like a hand pressed flat against his sternum. He didn't say any of this, he just looked at it. "First time seeing it," Ron said from beside him, leaning over Harry to get a better view through the compartment window. "Does something to you, doesn't it?" "Yeah," Harry said, "it does." The girl, Hermione Granger, she told them when she came back without the toad and decided to stay. Apparently because she'd found Ron's commentary on Hogwarts interesting enough to audit, was already standing with her bag, precise and ready, the kind of person who treated arrival like a scheduled event. "We should gather our things," she said. "The train stops in 2 minutes. We literally just have to walk off the train," Ron said. "And it helps to be prepared. We're not climbing a mountain, we're—" "Ron," Harry said pleasantly, "she's right." Ron looked at him. Harry was already standing. The platform outside was dark and loud and smelled of pine and cold water, the kind of cold that has altitude in it. A giant of a man, and Harry meant giant in the precise sense, not the common one, was bellowing for first years with a lamp the size of a small sun, and the magic Harry could feel from him was unusual, warm and heavy and earth-colored, the kind that doesn't do spells but runs through the ground and talks to animals. "Hagrid," Ron said. "He's the keeper of keys. My brothers said he's brilliant." They followed Hagrid to the boats, which turned out to be how first years crossed the lake, 4 to a boat, and the boats moved themselves, though Harry could feel the old magic underneath them the way you feel a current when you swim. Not mechanical, intentional. Something old had decided, long ago, that first years should approach Hogwarts by water and from the front, and the magic had simply agreed to keep doing it. He thought that was a very elegant piece of sustained enchantment. He thought this while Hermione and Ron continued their argument about preparedness, which had migrated to a new topic but kept the same essential shape. They went through the cliff face, through a tunnel in the rock, and the boats came out on the other side into a dimly lit underground harbor, stone all around and the castle looming directly above. They climbed a set of stone steps and stood in front of a great oak door. Hagrid knocked, 3 times deliberate, the door opened. McGonagall stood in the doorway in robes that were even more precisely pressed than the ones she'd worn to Privet Drive, which Harry hadn't thought possible. She scanned the assembled first years with the methodical focus of someone conducting a quality inspection. And when her eyes landed on Harry, they paused for exactly 1 second before moving on, which he appreciated. She led them inside through the entrance hall, high torchlit, with a staircase that he recognized from the Hogwarts architectural texts as the one that moved, and into a small antechamber off the Great Hall, where she told them about the sorting and left them to wait. Which was when the ghosts came through the wall. 3 of them, nearly transparent, drifting through the stone like it wasn't there, and most of the first years shrieked or stumbled back, which was understandable. Harry watched them with interest. He'd read about ghosts. The magical theory was that they were imprints, emotional residue, technically not the person, but the shape the person had carved into the ambient magic of a place. Like a tree root that keeps growing after the tree's been cut down. Fascinating, Harry said to no one in particular. The ghost that looked like a fat friar in monk's robes beamed at him. A student of the extraordinary, welcome, welcome. You're nearly headless, Nick, said a boy near Harry, round-faced, anxious-looking, still holding his toad. Neville Longbottom, that would be, whose name Harry knew from Ron's extensive briefing on the train. Neville had been looking nervous since they left the boats, the nervous of someone who had heard a great deal about what they were walking into and was not sure they were adequate to it. Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Porpington, at your service, the ghost said, then immediately got into a discussion with someone about the status of his neck. Harry turned and found himself standing next to a boy he recognized by description rather than sight. Blonde, pointed, with the kind of posture that said money before anything else did. He was looking around the antechamber with an expression of casual ownership, like a person walking through a house they've inherited and are already mentally redecorating. Draco Malfoy, he said, because the boy's gaze had landed on him and the scar with the same recognition everyone else had shown, but with a different quality under it, calculating, not odd. I know who you are, Malfoy said. He stuck out a hand. Draco Malfoy. Harry looked at the hand. He thought about what Ron had said on the train about Malfoy, the family, the history, the particular flavor of wizarding aristocracy that had decided, at some point, that the rest of the world owed them deference. He thought about the way Malfoy was looking at him like he was something that could be useful. He shook the hand. Harry Potter, he said, because the name was its own answer to most things. Malfoy's grip was firm and practiced. His eyes were doing rapid calculations. I heard you were raised by muggles, he said. The word muggles had a quality to it in Malfoy's mouth, not quite contempt, more like the word for something categorically inferior, said casually. I was, Harry said. That must have been useful, Harry said. Malfoy blinked. That wasn't the answer he'd prepared for. Useful, he repeated. Very quiet, Harry said. Lots of time to think. Malfoy looked at him for a moment with something that was either confusion or recalibration, and then McGonagall appeared at the door and said it was time, and they filed into the Great Hall. The hall was everything the descriptions had promised and still somehow more. The ceiling showed the night sky, real stars, Harry noted, not painted, the castle's magic somehow making the stone above them continuous with the darkness outside, and the 4 long tables with their students were rivers of color, the floating candles above them haloing everything in warm light. Harry walked in with the other first years and felt the combined attention of the entire school and did not break his stride. He heard his name moving through the hall in whispers, the way fire moves through dry grass. He did not look for it. The sorting hat sat on a stool at the front of the hall. It was old and battered, and had the specific look of something that had been important for so long it no longer needed to announce itself. When it opened its brim and began to sing, Harry listened with genuine attention, not to the words exactly, which were the traditional overview of the 4 houses, but to what was underneath the words. The particular quality of the magic in the hat, very old and very patient, with a particular cast to it that suggested something that had spent centuries listening. The hat, Harry thought, was probably very good company. McGonagall read from her scroll and students went up one by one, and Harry watched the hat's process. It never took more than a minute. Some students it sorted almost before they sat, a sharp, decisive decision, like someone recognizing a face in a crowd. Others it sat on for longer, not because it was confused, but because it was being thorough, the way a careful reader finishes a paragraph before marking the page. Granger, Hermione. Hermione walked up with her back very straight, and her expression carrying the particular terror of someone who was extremely competent and desperately afraid they might somehow fail to demonstrate it. The hat came down over her head and said Gryffindor before she'd settled into the stool. Hermione exhaled so audibly that Harry could hear it across the hall. Longbottom, Neville, went to Gryffindor after a longer pause. Harry could see Neville's hands gripping the stool edge until his knuckles went white, and felt something in the vicinity of his own chest recognized that particular grip. The hands of someone holding on because they're not sure what happens if they let go. Malfoy Draco had the hat on his head for approximately 2 seconds before it shouted Slytherin with an enthusiasm that suggested there had been no real suspense. Potter, Harry. The hall went so quiet it rang. Harry walked to the stool and sat down. The hat came over his head and he was in the dark, and then the hat started talking. Well, it said in a voice that wasn't exactly a voice, more like a thought that had found words. "This is unusual, is it?" Harry said back because it seemed rude not to engage. "You're the first student I've sorted in 243 years who was already conversant in legilimency principles before sitting down." The hat sounded, if not surprised, then interested. "You developed a version of it yourself. Remarkable." "I didn't know that's what it was called," Harry said. "The room feeling, that's what it is." "Very early onset self-taught, the magic of you is quite something, Mr. Potter. I won't pretend otherwise." A pause during which Harry could feel the hat doing what it did, not reading exactly, more like listening, the way old things listen. "You've spent a great deal of time alone, yes, and you're afraid of what that's done to you." Harry considered this. "Not afraid," he said, aware. Another pause. "You could be great in any of the 4 houses genuinely." "That's not something I say often. Ravenclaw would celebrate what you are, Slytherin would use it. Hufflepuff would anchor it." The hat's voice had a quality like turning pages. "But you didn't come here for celebration or to be used or even to be anchored. You came here because you want to matter to someone, and you want to be somewhere worth mattering to." Harry didn't answer that because the hat was right and they both knew it. "Gryffindor," the hat said, with something in it that wasn't just a decision but a welcome. The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry lifted the hat off his head, handed it back to McGonagall, who gave him a look that might have contained the beginning of a smile, and walked to the Gryffindor table where he sat beside Hermione, who was already applauding, and across from a pair of identical red-haired twins who were looking at him with the expression of people who had just received very interesting information. "Bloody hell," one of the twins said. "The hat took about 4 seconds. Decisive," the other said. "Was that quick?" Harry asked. "The hat took about 40 seconds with me," Hermione said. "It was considering alternatives." "It took me 30, Ron said, dropping into the seat beside Harry with his robes somewhat disordered. Apparently he'd been sorted while Harry was paying attention to the twins. "Gryffindors have always been Gryffindors," he said, with the tone of someone quoting something he'd heard so often it had lost meaning. "What was it like?" Hermione asked Harry. "The hat, I mean, did it speak to you?" "Yes," Harry said. "What did it say?" Harry looked at her. She was leaning forward with the intensity of someone who had 1,000 more questions behind that one. He thought, as he had on the train, that she was interesting, the kind of interesting that would be either very good or very challenging, possibly both at once. "It said I was unusual," Harry said. "That's all. It was polite about it," Ron snorted. Hermione sat back with the expression of someone filling in their own blanks, which Harry suspected was generally how she operated. The sorting finished, Dumbledore stood and said a few words. Harry paid close attention to Dumbledore, because Dumbledore was the piece he'd been thinking about most and had the least information on, and the feast appeared. The food arriving was an extraordinary piece of sustained conjuration, and Harry spent approximately 40 seconds analyzing how it worked before Ron put a dish of roast potatoes in front of him and said, "Eat, mate. You're staring at a dish like it owes you money," and Harry decided the analysis could wait. He ate and he listened and he watched. The Great Hall at dinner was a masterclass in information. The 4 tables each had their own energy, Gryffindor loud and warm, Ravenclaw quieter and more intense, Hufflepuff genuinely the most pleasant-seeming group of people in the room, Slytherin structured along lines of hierarchy that were visible if you knew what to look for. He could see Malfoy 3 seats down at his table holding court with 2 large boys on either side who were clearly muscle and not much else, and a girl with sleek dark hair who was clearly neither, but who everyone in the immediate group was more careful around than they admitted. At the high table, Dumbledore sat in the center and Harry studied him. He was old in a way that Harry's books had not quite conveyed, not physically or not only physically, but historically old, the kind of old that means a person has been important for so long they have become part of the landscape. He had the quality of a landmark. Harry could feel his magic from across the hall, and it was genuinely extraordinary, layered and complex and precise, like a piece of music where every note was doing 3 things simultaneously. He was also very clearly watching Harry, not staring, not obviously, but watching in the way that Harry watched rooms with peripheral attention that was much sharper than it appeared. Harry let him watch because there was nothing Harry was doing that needed to be hidden. 2 seats to Dumbledore's left, a pale man with dark, curtained hair and black robes that had the specific quality of someone who wore his clothes like armor was also watching Harry, but with an entirely different quality. Not curious, searching. Like someone who was looking for a specific thing and wasn't sure yet whether Harry was it. "That's Snape," Ron said, appearing at Harry's shoulder. "Potions teacher. My brothers say he's horrible, plays favorites with Slytherin and has been after the Dada job for years," Harry said. He was thinking about Snape's watching. "He's looking at you a lot," Ron added. "I noticed." "Does that bother you?" Harry thought about it honestly. "No," he said, "but I'd like to know why." He found out at breakfast the next morning. Not the real whys that came later, but the opening move. Snape swept through the Great Hall the way weather sweeps through, all black robes and contained energy, dropping schedules in front of students with the efficiency of someone who found the task beneath him but was too professional to do it badly. When he reached Harry, he paused. "Potter," he said in a voice like a door closing. "Harry Potter." The Great Hall did its trick with fire and dry grass again. "Professor Snape," Harry said pleasantly. Snape's black eyes were doing the same kind of rapid reading that Malfoy's had done the previous night, but more sophisticated and much less friendly. "Our new celebrity," he said. The words were shaped like an insult, but Harry couldn't quite feel the anger in them. Underneath the performance there was something else, something that wasn't contempt so much as a very old wound flexing. "I'm not sure I'm much of a celebrity," Harry said. "I haven't done anything interesting yet." That was technically true. Everything interesting he'd done had been private. Something moved through Snape's expression. He hadn't expected that response. The self-deprecation had wrong-footed him, and for a half-second he was reading Harry again with recalibrated attention. Then his eyes moved to Harry's scar, and the old wound tightened again, and he swept on down the table. Ron, who had been holding his pumpkin juice arrested halfway to his mouth throughout this exchange, lowered it slowly. "That was it," he said. "People say he could make students cry with that voice." "He's got a good voice," Harry said. "It'd be a shame to cry over it." Ron stared at him for a moment and then laughed, a real, uncomplicated laugh, the kind that doesn't have an audience, and Hermione, who was sitting across the table with a schedule and a highlighter she'd produced from somewhere, looked up with an expression that Harry was learning to read as "I have opinions, but I'm choosing not to share them yet." The first week of classes was, by Harry's assessment, roughly equivalent in difficulty to the Latin exercises he'd been doing at age 9. This was not a criticism of Hogwarts. The curriculum was clearly designed for children who had never done magic before, who were encountering the theory and practice simultaneously, who needed the scaffolding. Harry had done the scaffolding 7 years ago in the dark by feel. He was not going to be unkind about it. He was, however, bored, and boredom was something he had very little practice managing in a room full of people. The solution he found was to do the classwork correctly but quietly, to pay attention not to the content but to the system, how the magic was being taught, what theory underlay the methods, where the official curriculum was incomplete or oversimplified. There was interesting material even in simple exercises if you looked underneath them. Wingardium Leviosa, the standard levitation charm, which Harry had been doing wandlessly since he was 4, turned out, when he really examined the mechanics through his wand, to have an elegant internal structure he hadn't fully articulated before. The wand clarified things. It was like using a microscope on something you'd only ever seen with the naked eye. He also, in these first classes, learned something important about himself. He was not patient with pretension, but he was endlessly patient with genuine effort. Neville, who was in most of his classes and was struggling with everything from the pronunciation of spells to the grip on his wand, received something from Harry that Harry hadn't planned to give a quiet, specific, practical help. Not doing things for him, just noticing where the problem was and saying it plainly. "Your wand grips too tight," Harry said to him in charms before the second class had properly started. "You're holding it like it might run away, it won't." Neville looked at his hand, adjusted, looked up. Is this better? Try now," Harry said. Neville performed the levitation charm. The feather rose shakily but unmistakably. Neville's face did something complicated and bright. "How did you know?" Hermione asked from Harry's other side, because Hermione was constitutionally incapable of not asking things. "His knuckles were white," Harry said. "Yes, but how did that tell you? Magic needs to flow. If you're gripping the channel that tight, you're fighting it, like trying to talk with your jaw clenched." He paused. "Does that make sense?" Hermione looked at him with that particular filing away expression. "Yes," she said, and then looked down at her own wand with the air of someone checking for gripping they hadn't been aware of. Transfiguration was the first class where Harry felt genuinely engaged. Professor McGonagall ran her classroom the way she ran herself, precise, demanding, zero tolerance for sloppy thinking, and with an underlying warmth that she expressed not through softness but through taking her students seriously. She turned a desk into a pig and back again at the start of class, which the students around Harry gasped at, and which Harry watched with appreciation because the mechanics of it were extraordinary. The transformation was simultaneously molecular and conceptual, and holding both levels of change at once required a kind of focused flexibility that was quite different from straightforward conjuration. McGonagall moved through the theory and set them to transfiguring a matchstick into a needle. Students produced things ranging from nearly needles to barely changed matchsticks. Harry looked at the matchstick in front of him, thought in clean lines, and tapped it once with his wand. The needle was perfect. McGonagall said, appearing at his desk. She picked the needle up and examined it. Exact dimensions and material composition. Steel, 0.3 of a millimeter at the tip, approximately 1 millimeter diameter, Harry said. "I think. I was working from memory of an actual needle." McGonagall set it back down. She looked at him for a moment, then made a note on her register. "Can you do the reverse?" she asked. Harry tapped the needle, the matchstick was back. McGonagall made another note. Then she moved on without comment, because she was McGonagall and comment wasn't how she operated. But at the end of class, as students filed out, she said with her back to him, "Potter, stay a moment." He stayed. When the room was empty, she turned to face him and looked at him the way she had in the kitchen of Privet Drive, with that quality of someone who has revised their categories once and is not entirely sure the new categories are adequate either. "You used Wandless technique to enhance the wand cast," she said. "Yes," Harry said, "the wand sharpens the edges. The Wandless is what's underneath, they work well together. That shouldn't be possible for a first year." "I know," Harry said, "I'm sorry if it makes things complicated." "Don't apologize," she said sharply enough that he blinked. "Never apologize for what you can do, that's not what I'm saying." She straightened a stack of papers on her desk, not because they needed straightening. "I'm saying be careful about how visible you are in some contexts." "Why?" "Because there are people in this school who will feel threatened by what you are. And threatened people make poor decisions." She looked at him. "I want to be clear, I am not asking you to hide or diminish yourself. I am asking you to be aware there's a difference." Harry thought about Petunia and the glass and the wasp. "I know the difference," he said, "but I'm not going to be careful about the wrong things." McGonagall looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said, "I don't suppose you are." She let him go. The second week of school, the Quidditch situation happened. Harry hadn't planned to try out. Quidditch was on his list of things to investigate eventually, but it wasn't urgent. He had more interesting theoretical problems to work through. What happened was that he was crossing the courtyard on a Wednesday afternoon, heading toward the library, when a first-year named Cora in Ravenclaw had her broomstick taken by the wind and launched 20 feet in the air, and a second later it came loose and plummeted toward a group of third years below. Harry reached out and stopped it, not with his wand. He had his wand in his bag. He stopped it with the casual, reaching extension of magic that he'd been doing since he was 6, just caught it out of the air like catching a ball, and it hung there at head height until the third years had scattered from underneath it, and then he set it down gently on the flagstones. Cora stood there with her mouth open. The third years stood there with their mouths open. 2 second years who'd been walking past stood there with their mouths open. Harry retrieved his bag and continued toward the library. He made it approximately 15 feet before McGonagall's voice stopped him. "Potter," he turned. She was standing by the courtyard entrance and had apparently witnessed the entire thing. She was looking at him with an expression that had moved, in about 30 seconds, through surprise, rapid calculation, and had arrived somewhere that looked like decision. "Oliver Wood," she said, like she was answering a question she'd been holding for a while. "I'm going to introduce you to Oliver Wood." Oliver Wood was the Gryffindor Quidditch captain, a 6th year with the focused, slightly driven energy of someone who had organized their personality entirely around a sport. He shook Harry's hand with aggressive enthusiasm and then put a snitch in the air and said, "Catch that." And Harry caught it in 3 seconds, mostly because tracking moving objects had been a practice exercise he'd used to develop his spatial awareness since age 8. "Seeker," Wood said with the reverence of a religious experience. "I've never actually played," Harry said. "You just caught a snitch in 3 seconds in a crosswind," Wood said, "with no training on the ground." "It's just tracking," Harry said. Wood looked at him like he'd said something in a foreign language. "Come to practice Saturday," Wood said. "Please, I'm asking as a person." Harry went to practice on Saturday. He liked flying. He genuinely liked it in the clean, uncomplicated way. He liked fixing things and liked the magic when it did exactly what he wanted. The broom responded to intent the way the holly wand did, conversation rather than command, and 3,000 feet above the ground with the Scottish sky vast in every direction and the magic of the castle rising below him like heat from a road, he felt something he didn't have a word for. Not joy exactly, more like rightness. The feeling of being in the correct shape. Wood watched from the ground and didn't say a word for 45 minutes, which Harry thought was probably the longest he'd gone without speaking in his life. What Harry did not like was the attention the Quidditch tryout generated. By Sunday morning, the whole school appeared to know that a first year had made the Gryffindor team. The whispers in the corridors had multiplied. They'd been there since the sorting, but this added a new quality to them, a speculation that he found tedious. He was not interesting because he could do things. He was interested in what the things meant. Draco Malfoy cornered him in the corridor outside the potions classroom on Monday morning. Cornered was not quite the right word because you needed to be uncertain of yourself for a corridor block to feel like a corner. But it was the structural form of a corner, Malfoy, plus Crabbe and Goyle, occupying the width of the hall, with that calculating expression Harry had been watching since the sorting. "First year on the house team," Malfoy said. "That's against the rules." "McGonagall got a special exemption," Harry said. "You could ask her about the process if you're interested in the administrative details." Malfoy looked at him for a moment. The calculating was still there, but there was something else now, an edge of something that might become frustration when he was alone. "You should be careful, Potter," he said. There are things at this school that matter, the right connections. The right, Draco, Harry said. Malfoy stopped. I'm not going to be interested in the right connections, Harry said without unfriendliness. I'm also not going to be worried about the wrong ones, but thank you for the thought. Malfoy looked at him for a long moment, the longest pause Harry had gotten from him yet, and then stepped aside, not defeated exactly. More like someone who has filed something under ongoing problem and intends to return to it later. Harry went to potions. Snape ran potions the way a composer might run an orchestra if the composer was also the conductor, and also privately convinced that most of the musicians didn't deserve their instruments. He moved through the dungeon classroom with absolute authority, and the subject matter was genuinely fascinating. Potion making was chemistry laced with magic, precise and variable simultaneously. And the theory of how magical intent interacted with physical compounds was something Harry had only touched on in his reading. He was paying complete attention, which Snape apparently did not expect. Potter, Snape said without looking up from the board, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? The class went very quiet. Ron, beside Harry, was already wincing with the preemptive sympathy of someone who had been told this teacher asked trick questions. Draft of living death, Harry said. One of the most powerful sleeping potions known. Asphodel is a member of the lily family, which has particular resonance with death symbolism in magical botany. Wormwood in combination amplifies the sedative compound and extends duration beyond what either ingredient manages alone. Snape turned from the board. Where, he said, in a voice stripped of all its theatrical quality and stripped, therefore, down to something more genuine, did you read that? Most potent potions, Harry said. In Libadius Borrage's supplementary compendium, the Borrage has better analysis of the compound interactions. Snape looked at him, not the searching look from before. A different one, the look of someone who has been looking for a specific thing and has just found it and is not entirely sure how to feel about the finding. And what, Snape said, is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane? None, Harry said. Different names for the same plant. Aconite is the third, extremely poisonous in raw form. The alkaloid aconitine affects the sodium channels in cardiac and nerve cells, which is interesting because the way magical processing of the plant changes that mechanism is what makes it safe for the wolfsbane potion specifically. He paused. Though I think the exact mechanism of the magical neutralization is still debated in the literature. The classroom was silent enough that Harry could hear the torches. It is, Snape said, after a pause that had several layers to it. The Flint-Henderson paper in 1987 argued for a complete alkaloid transformation. Alderton's counterargument in 1990 suggested partial. Alderton was right, Harry said. The Flint-Henderson methodology had a flaw in the dosage modeling. If you look at the endpoint toxicology, I am aware of the Alderton paper, Potter, Snape said, with a precise quality that was not quite anger and was possibly something much less familiar to him than anger. Sorry, Harry said. I didn't mean to, no, Snape said, and it came out flatter than he'd intended, Harry could tell. You didn't. He turned back to the board. The class breathed again. Ron looked at Harry with the expression of a man who has just watched something he will be discussing for some time. Did you just, Ron whispered, start an academic argument with Snape? He brought up the Alderton paper first, Harry said. He absolutely did not. Weasley, Snape said without turning around. 5 points from Gryffindor. Ron slumped. Harry brewed his potion, which was flawless, and handed it in without comment. After class, in the corridor, Hermione fell into step beside him with that expression she wore when she was working up to something. The Alderton paper, she said, I've never heard of it. It's in the restricted section of the library, Harry said. I think, based on the citation pattern in Borrage's compendium, if you can get a teacher to sign you in, it's worth reading. And if I can't get a teacher to sign me in, Harry looked at her sideways. I'm sure you could find another way, he said. Hermione looked straight ahead. I'm sure I could, she said primly. They were not friends yet exactly, they were two very precise instruments learning each other's frequencies, which was a process that took time. But Harry thought, walking down the corridor with Hermione on one side and Ron appearing on the other saying something about Snape's face during the Alderton exchange, that the shape of something was forming. The outline. He thought about what the hat had said about mattering and being worth mattering to. He thought the shape looked about right. 3 weeks in, Harry found something he hadn't expected. Hogwarts had a pulse, not metaphorical, actual. The castle was alive in a way that went beyond the moving staircases and talking portraits and ghost traffic. It was aware, in the low, patient way that very old things are aware, sensing in the dark the way Harry sensed rooms. He discovered it by accident during a late-night walk he'd taken when he couldn't sleep, navigating the corridors with his own spatial sense and suddenly feeling the castle's sense pressing back against his like two hands touching through a glass. It wasn't threatening. It was curious. And more than curious, it was welcoming, in the way that things welcome something they recognize. He stood in the corridor at 2 in the morning and thought at the castle, hello. The castle thought back in the way mountains think, slow and vast and certain. He started learning its rhythms, which corridors ran cold after midnight, which staircases preferred certain destinations, which rooms were deliberately hidden and which were just forgotten. The castle showed him things the way it probably hadn't shown students in a very long time, or perhaps had never shown them, because you needed a certain kind of attention to notice you were being shown. The 7th floor corridor on his 3rd nighttime walk took him past a stretch of blank wall that pulsed with magic so dense it was almost visible. He stopped and stood there for a while reading it. Something behind that wall could become whatever was needed most. He couldn't quite see how it worked, the mechanics were very old and somewhat opaque, but the shape of it was clear. It was a room that listened. He appreciated that very much. On the night he found the blank wall, he was not alone, which he only discovered on his way back. He'd taken a different corridor, cut through the 3rd floor landing, and was heading back toward the tower when he felt it, not a person exactly, but a quality of magic that was wrong in the same way a chord played slightly flat is wrong. Not obviously, not loudly. Just off in a way that pulled at his attention the way a crooked picture pulls at the eye. It was coming from the end of the corridor. There was a door at the end of the corridor. He'd been past it twice before and noted it without investigating, locked, clearly, and with a quality of warding that was intentional rather than accidental. But the wrongness wasn't from behind the door tonight. It was from a figure moving away from the door back toward the staircases, a figure in a turban that Harry recognized as Professor Quirrell. Quirrell didn't see him. Harry stood in a shadow by the wall and watched him go and felt that wrongness trail after him like a smell. It was not Quirrell's magic. It was something else, using Quirrell, something that rode inside him the way a voice rides sound, present but secondary, and what Harry had felt in that half-second of contact was something so cold and so purposeful that it went past threat and into something else. Something hungry. Something that had been patient for a very long time. Harry stood in the corridor for a long moment after Quirrell had gone. Then he went back to his dormitory and lay on his bed and thought carefully about several things. The locked corridor, the wrongness in Quirrell, the warmth of what the castle had shown him upstairs on the 7th floor, the shape of the year arranging itself around him. Ron was asleep in the next bed, making small sounds of comfortable unconsciousness. Through the dormitory window, the ground stretched dark and vast to the forest edge. Harry stared at the ceiling and worked through what he'd felt in that half-second contact, tried to put a shape to it, the way he put shapes to everything. Old, cold, aware. Diminished, which was the important part, the part that changed the texture of the danger. Whatever it was not at full strength. It was working through a person because it had no other option. It wanted something specifically, and it was inside a man who was teaching defense against the dark arts and standing outside locked 3rd-floor corridors at 2 in the morning. Harry thought about this for another few minutes. Then he thought, I'm going to need to know what's behind that door. He fell asleep thinking about it, which was unusual. Most things didn't stay with him into sleep. This one did, which told him something. It told him this was the thing the year was actually about. He didn't mention it to Ron or Hermione. Not yet. Not because he didn't trust them, something about them had moved in 3 weeks from interesting to necessary, which was a category he didn't hand out easily. But because he needed to know more before he could explain it, and he needed to know it without other people's reactions affecting how he processed what he'd found. The castle was quiet. The night stretched on. Harry Potter, who had spent 11 years alone in the dark learning everything he could, lay in the first room he'd ever truly chosen to sleep in, surrounded by the first people he'd ever chosen to be near. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like a beginning. Chapter 3. The weight of being watched. October arrived the way Scottish weather arrives, without asking, all at once, turning the grounds from damp to properly cold overnight and making the lake look like hammered pewter every morning. The trees at the forest edge went red and gold, and the wind off the mountains had teeth in it, and Harry discovered that he genuinely liked all of this. The cold and the color and the particular quality of light that came with a Scottish autumn, which was not gentle light, was not trying to flatter anything, just illuminated things exactly as they were. He was sitting on the stone steps outside the castle on a Thursday morning in the first week of October, watching a pair of conjured sparrows navigate a wind current above the courtyard. Not actual conjured sparrows. He couldn't do animal conjuration at a level he was satisfied with yet. The anatomy was too complex to hold all at once. The biology had too many moving parts. These were constructs, magic shaped into sparrow approximations, and he was running them through flight patterns and seeing how long he could maintain the spell's internal coherence while thinking about something else entirely. What he was thinking about was the corridor. He'd been back twice since the night he'd seen Quirrell. Once to look at the door and once to look at the floor around it, and what he'd found on the second visit was a trace of magical residue near the door that was not Quirrell's and not the castle's and not any of the teachers. He'd been cataloging the teachers' magical signatures all term, a habit he developed purely out of curiosity, the way other people catalog birdsong or car models. This trace was cold and thin and moved along the floor with a directional quality, like it had been looking for something specific rather than simply being present. He was fairly sure the door was protecting something. He was also fairly sure the something was what Quirrell, or the thing in Quirrell, was trying to get to. The sparrows faltered. Harry redirected his attention and they steadied. What are those? He looked up. Hermione was standing 3 steps above him with her bag of books and her expression of professional interest, having apparently appeared from the castle without him noticing, which happened with Hermione because she moved with the focused, direction of travel energy of someone who always knew exactly where they were going and went there without any of the ambient dithering that made most people trackable. Practice constructs, Harry said, sparrow-shaped. She sat down beside him and studied them. They're not anatomically accurate. I know, the wing joint mechanism's wrong, I'm working on it. The feathers aren't differentiated either. Primary and secondary flight feathers have different functions, so they should move differently, Harry said. Yes, I've been thinking about that. The problem is holding the differential motion pattern at the same time as the structural integrity the spell wants to simplify. Hermione was quiet for a moment, watching. Then, with the tentative quality of someone offering a solution they're not sure they should have. If you layered 2 separate motion charms rather than one integrated one, the differential motion would be an emergent property rather than something you're maintaining consciously. Harry looked at her. He pulled the sparrows apart into component magics, restructured, layered 2 separate charms the way she described, and released. The sparrows flew. The wing motion was different, richer, the primary and secondary feathers moving with a genuine independence. Better, Harry said. Hermione smiled. Not the smile she gave teachers when she got the right answer, the other one. The one she hadn't been using as long and wasn't as practiced with. That meant she was actually pleased. You got there immediately, she said. It was your idea. You implemented it in about 4 seconds without a wand. The wand slows the refinement stage, Harry said. For rough work it's fine, but for detail, he stopped. You don't mind that I did it faster? It wasn't quite a question. Hermione looked at him steadily. I used to mind that kind of thing, she said, with the directness she used when she was being honest about something that cost her. When someone did something faster, I thought it meant something about me. She paused. It doesn't, does it? No, Harry said. We're just different shapes. Hermione nodded once with the precision of someone filing a conclusion. Then she pulled out a charms textbook and opened it to a page somewhere in the middle and said, I've been thinking about the sticking charm we're covering Friday. Flitwick's method is inefficient. He's applying the charm globally when selective application would use less magical energy and be more precise, Harry said. I know, I did it the selective way last week and he said I was overcomplicating it. Hermione looked up from her book. That's maddening. He's teaching to the middle, Harry said without criticism. That's his job. But Hermione, he looked at her. He's a good teacher. He just has a room full of students at different levels and 11 weeks to cover the material. He can't follow every branch. Hermione considered this with the slightly pained expression of someone whose instinct is to argue and whose intellect keeps intervening. Fine, she said, but I want to know the selective method. After dinner, Harry said. She nodded, opened her book again, and they sat on the steps in companionable quiet while the sparrows turned and banked in the cold October air above them. Harry thought that this was a thing he hadn't known how to do before Hogwarts, be quiet with another person, at the same speed, without it requiring effort. He thought it might be one of the more important things he'd learned so far. Ron found them 20 minutes later, coming from the direction of the owlery with a letter from home, and sat on Harry's other side and said, without any particular resentment, You two have been doing that thing again where you sit somewhere and the air gets smarter. We were discussing charm mechanics, Hermione said. Right, Ron said. Where I said. He opened his letter and read it with the warm, uncomplicated attention he always gave things from his family, and Harry watched this sideways with the particular quiet interest he reserved for things he didn't have a category for yet. Letters from a family that assumed you wanted to hear from them. Letters that assumed you were coming back. My mum wants to know if I've made friends, Ron said, still reading. What are you going to tell her? Harry asked. Ron looked up. He grinned, the same uncomplicated grin from the train. I'm going to tell her one of them is stupidly powerful and the other one is the most intimidating person in our year, and somehow both of them are actually all right. That's almost entirely complimentary, Hermione said. The intimidating part is a compliment, Ron said. At Weasley family dinners, intimidating is the main survival skill. Harry filed this away. He was still building his model of what a family was from observation and inference the way he'd built his model of Latin, patterns first, then exceptions, then the shape of the whole thing. The Weasley data was consistently warm and consistently loud, and apparently involved a great deal of disagreement that didn't mean anything permanent, which was very different from Dursley disagreement, which was cold and meant everything and stayed. The first Quidditch practice of the season happened the following Saturday, and it was the first time Harry understood that some things were going to be complicated in ways that had nothing to do with magic. Oliver Wood's training sessions had the structure of a military campaign and the emotional intensity of one. He distributed a 17-point pre-practice briefing, which Hermione had read in full and annotated, which Ron had looked at and put in his bag, and which Harry had scanned in 30 seconds and understood entirely, and then spent the walk to the pitch thinking about the Quirrell situation instead. He could fly. He was honestly extraordinary in the air in the same way he was extraordinary on the ground. The broom was just another channel, another kind of conversation, and he'd figured out within the first hour of his first practice that it responded not to physical commands but to intent, and once you understood that, flight became as natural as walking. More natural, actually, because walking required the constant low-level mechanical attention of balance, and flight, once you let the broom talk back, was something closer to floating. The problem was the other players. Not with him, they were fine, they were his teammates, he liked them in an abstract general way. The problem was that being on the pitch meant being looked at. Really looked at not in the corridor whisper way but by the whole school, Quidditch being what it was, and the watching had a weight to it that he hadn't fully felt before. He'd spent 11 years invisible, and now he was the opposite, and the opposite was strange. He caught the snitch in 4 minutes at the first practice. Wood made a sound like a man who had been given a gift he hadn't asked for but was extremely grateful about. 4 minutes, Wood said on the ground after. The school record for snitch capture in a professional match is 6 minutes. You caught it in 4 in practice. Without, he stopped. Can I ask you something? Sure, Harry said, coiling his broom handle back. Are you actually watching the snitch or are you doing something else? Harry looked at him. Oliver Wood was not a stupid person. He had organized his intelligence almost entirely around Quidditch, which was somewhat limiting, but within that limit he was genuinely perceptive. Both, Harry said. What's the other thing? I feel the whole pitch, Harry said. Not just the snitch, where everything is. It lets me predict where the snitch is going to be rather than reacting to where it's gone. Wood stared at him. You predict the snitch. It's not random, Harry said. It has patterns. It avoids being near high-speed movement, which is bludgers and charging chasers. If you can track those patterns and map where the snitch isn't going to be, you can narrow where it is going to be quite quickly. Wood looked at him for another long moment and then turned to the team. Everyone, he said, with the quiet intensity of a man who has just experienced religious conversion. This is why you listen to the Seeker. Harry played his first Quidditch match in November against Slytherin. The crowd was the loudest thing he'd ever heard that wasn't weather, which was its own kind of information, 10 times more people than he'd ever been in a space with, all of them making sound at the same time, and the sound had a pressure to it, a physical quality that changed the air. He sat on his broom at the edge of the pitch before the start and let himself feel the whole of it. The crowd, the other players, the pitch in its dimensions, the cold and the wind and the snitch somewhere below him running its patterns. Slytherin's Seeker was a boy called Terrence Higgs, who was faster on a broom than most people Harry had practiced against, and who was looking at Harry across the pitch with competitive attention. Harry nodded at him. Higgs blinked, then nodded back. The game started and Harry went high, the way he always went at the start, the whole pitch visible from above, the full spatial picture, every player a point of moving light in his awareness. He tracked the snitch's patterns from altitude for 90 seconds, building the probability map in his head, and then he saw it. The snitch, running its avoidance pattern around the east goalpost, was about to be pushed outward by a bludger that was heading for a Slytherin chaser. When the chaser moved and the bludger followed, the snitch would have 2 seconds of relatively open space at the south end of the pitch about 30 feet off the ground. He dove. He came out of the dive at speed, leveled at 30 feet, reached out, and felt the snitch hit his palm. The whole thing had taken 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The crowd made a sound he'd never heard a crowd make before, a collective exhale followed by noise so large it had a shape, an actual wave of sound washing over the pitch. He landed. Ron was on the ground near the pitch entrance, screaming something with his fists in the air. Hermione was beside him with an expression of restrained delight that was barely restrained at all. Oliver Wood landed beside Harry, put both hands on his shoulders, said how, and then ran out of words entirely, which Harry suspected was unusual for Oliver Wood. The bludger pushed the snitch, Harry said. 4 minutes, Wood said. 4 minutes 11 seconds. I could have been faster, but I wanted to be sure. Wood made the sound again, the gift he wasn't expecting sound, and the team descended, and it was very loud and someone clapped Harry on the back hard enough that he staggered, which was fine, and the Slytherin team left the pitch with the particular posture of people doing their best with a difficult situation. And Harry thought the whole thing had been genuinely good, which was a word he used carefully and meant precisely. Later that afternoon, in the Three Broomsticks, Oliver Wood had declared a team celebration and Professor McGonagall had produced butterbeer from somewhere, looking quietly delighted while maintaining full plausible deniability. Harry sat between Ron and a chaser called Alicia Spinnet and felt the warm noise of a group of people who had done something well together and thought it was an interesting feeling. New. He was still cataloging it. Ron was doing an impression of Wood's face when Harry caught the snitch, which was very accurate. Hermione was telling Wood that the 14-minute gap between the first and second bludger runs was a tactical vulnerability he should address in training, which Wood was listening to with the expression of a person who hadn't expected to be receiving strategy notes from a first-year girl, but was too aware that she was correct to object. Harry listened and watched and thought about Quirrell. He'd been thinking about Quirrell for weeks in the background of everything else, the way you think about a problem you haven't found the entry point for yet. He'd checked the third-floor corridor 5 times. He'd checked it with his spatial sense extended to its fullest range and felt the magic behind the door more clearly each time, layered protections, at least 6 of them, each from a different hand. McGonagall's transfiguration he recognized. Flitwick's work precise and elegant, something from Sprout, something from a hand he didn't know yet. The last layer was different from the others, not a spell exactly. More like an intention, pure and ancient, set in place by something very old and tired and still somewhere hoping. And then beneath it all, the cold trace that he'd felt on Quirrell. The thing inside Quirrell wanted through those protections. It had been patient, was still being patient, in the way that very dangerous things are patient when they have no other option. It was watching, learning the pattern of the protections, looking for gaps. Harry had a working theory, which he hadn't shared with anyone, about what was behind the door. The theory required him to think about the Gringotts report he'd read in the Prophet back in August, vault break-in, nothing taken suspicious. And it required him to remember something Nicholas Flamel's biography had mentioned in passing, in a book he'd conjured from a private library at age 9, about a stone that had no business being in a school. He was fairly sure he was right. He was also fairly sure that if he went to Dumbledore with this, one of 2 things would happen. Either Dumbledore already knew and had planned for it in some way Harry couldn't yet see, which made it an active situation, or Dumbledore didn't know, which seemed unlikely. He thought Dumbledore knew. He thought Dumbledore had set the protections deliberately, had put the stone here deliberately, had perhaps intended this to be a test of some kind. And he thought this made Dumbledore either very clever or very certain, and possibly both. And he wasn't sure yet which kind of certain Dumbledore was. He needed more information, he needed to see behind the door. "You've gone somewhere," Ron said in his ear. Harry came back. "Sorry." "Butterbeer," Ron said and handed him a mug. Harry drank it and decided he could think about Quirrell tomorrow. Tonight he was in a warm pub with his team and his friends, and it was enough. The troll happened on Halloween. He'd been aware of it before the announcement, obviously. He'd been in the Great Hall at the feast when Quirrell burst in, and he'd felt the wrongness of Quirrell like a cold hand on his neck from 20 feet away, that same off-chord quality he'd been tracking for weeks. Quirrell's performance of panic was convincing to everyone who didn't know what was riding inside him, but it was just a performance. Underneath it, the cold thing was very satisfied, and Harry noted this and filed it because it told him something important about Quirrell's agency. Some of it was still his own. He was choosing to cooperate, which was different from being simply ridden. He was already on his feet, following McGonagall's instructions to return to dormitories, when he remembered that Hermione was in the girls' bathroom on the 2nd floor. She'd been upset, he knew why. He'd seen Parvati Paddle's face after Charms and heard Ron's voice through the library door at lunch, and had been irritated with Ron about it, quietly, for 6 hours by the time the feast started. Hermione cried when she was very upset, which she would have told no one and which Harry knew anyway, the way he knew most things that people thought they were keeping quiet. He stepped out of the stream of moving students, let them flow around him, and looked at Ron. "Hermione's in the 2nd floor bathroom," he said. Ron's face went through several things quickly, landed on guilt. "Right," he said. "Right, we need to." Harry was already moving. Ron caught up. The corridor to the 2nd floor bathroom smelled the troll first. The smell was extraordinary, like very old meat and cave water and something mineral, and then Harry rounded the corner and saw it. Mountain troll, 12 feet if it was an inch, gray-green and moving with the particular confidence of something that had never needed to worry about what was coming the other way. He stopped. The troll had not noticed them. It was ambling toward the bathroom door. "Get a teacher," Harry said to Ron. "I'm not leaving you." "Then get behind me," Harry said in a different voice, the one he used when he meant it. Ron got behind him. The troll hit the bathroom door with one shoulder and it went inward like paper, and from inside Harry heard Hermione scream, once startled, and he moved. He walked into the bathroom, which already smelled considerably worse than the corridor, and assessed the situation in approximately 1 second. Hermione backed against the far wall of sinks, the troll turning toward her with the slow, implacable momentum of something very large and not very bright, but extremely motivated by the presence of a small moving thing that had made noise at it. Harry put himself between Hermione and the troll. "Harry," Hermione said in a voice that was doing its best. "Step back," Harry said to her, then to the troll conversationally. "Hey," the troll turned. It looked at Harry with small, wet eyes. It swung its club, a thing like a stripped tree trunk, immense, and Harry stepped aside without hurrying and felt the air of the swing move past his face, and then he reached out with his magic and took hold of the club. Not the troll. He took the club. The troll tried to swing again and found it couldn't, and this was deeply confusing, and it swung harder and the club didn't move at all, and the troll swung with its full weight and the club still didn't move, and the troll's arm took the impact of all that force reflected back, and the troll made a sound like a large wet thing hitting the ground and sat down extremely hard. The bathroom shook. The troll looked at Harry from the floor with an expression that contained no malice. It had never had malice. Trolls didn't work that way. It was just a large, frightened animal that had been let into a building it didn't understand, and Harry looked at it and thought for a moment. He pointed at the troll's forehead, thought very clearly, and put it to sleep. Not violently, not painfully. Just a clear, firm intention of sleep pushed through the holly wand with the wandless underneath it, and the troll lay down on the bathroom floor and closed its small wet eyes and breathed the deep, slow breathing of something completely unconscious. Harry stepped back. Ron was in the doorway. He looked at the troll, at Harry, at the club, at the troll again. He said, you picked up its club while it was using it. I didn't pick it up, I held it, Harry said. That's the same. It's not the same, one involves lifting, Harry, Hermione said, in a voice that was not doing its best anymore, was actually shaking slightly, and when Harry turned she was pressed against the wall and looking at him with an expression that had several layers, and the one on top was relief, and the one under it was something he hadn't seen on Hermione's face before, which was awe. He didn't know what to do with that, so he said, "Are you hurt?" Hermione looked down at herself, checking, and her practical brain had apparently engaged because she straightened up and said, "No, I'm not hurt." She looked at the troll. "How did you know where I was?" "I knew," Harry said. "That's not an answer. It's the honest one." He looked at her. "Ron told me you were upset." "I should have come earlier. I'm sorry I didn't." Hermione looked at Ron. Ron had gone pink. "I said some things at lunch that I shouldn't have said," Ron said to his shoes. "It was unkind." "I am genuinely sorry, Hermione." Hermione looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you," which in Hermione's vocabulary Harry had learned was the full acceptance of an apology, no extended grievance, no withdrawal, just the clean closing of the account. McGonagall arrived then, followed by Snape and Quirrell, and surveyed the scene with the specific expression of someone who had expected to arrive at a situation requiring intervention and has arrived instead at its aftermath. She looked at Harry for a long time. "The troll is asleep," she said. "Yes," Harry said, "you put it to sleep." "It was confused," Harry said, "and scared. There wasn't any reason to hurt it." Snape had crouched next to the troll, apparently checking its condition. He stood back up and looked at Harry with that new expression, the one that had started in potions and had been developing slowly, the way photographs develop, into something Harry didn't have a clean name for. Not respect, not quite, more like the reluctant acknowledgement of someone who has been arguing against a conclusion and has run out of objections. "A sleeping charm," Snape said. "Modified," Harry said. "Scaled for the body mass." Snape's eyes narrowed very slightly. "You scaled a sleeping charm for a 1,200-pound troll in real time." "It wasn't difficult," Harry said. "The modification's just a proportion." "I know what the modification is, Potter." Snape said it quietly, not angry, just that expression again. Quirrell stood near the door and looked at the troll and said nothing. Harry, without moving or looking directly at him, extended his awareness and felt the cold thing inside him. Very briefly, turn its attention toward Harry with a quality that was old and precise and assessing. Harry let it look. He kept his own surface entirely calm and open. The cold thing pulled back. Whatever it had been looking for, Harry had been careful not to show. McGonagall gave them each 5 points and a warning about being out of their dormitories on a night with a troll loose, which she delivered with the specific energy of someone whose heart isn't fully in the warning. And then she arranged for the troll to be removed, and Harry walked with Ron and Hermione back to the Gryffindor Tower. Hermione held it together until they were through the portrait hole. Then she sat down in an armchair by the fire and pressed her hands together in her lap and breathed with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing not to cry through sheer will. Harry sat on the arm of the chair. Not next to her, on the arm, so he was slightly above her and slightly to the side, and she didn't have to look directly at him if she didn't want to. "It's over," he said. "You're fine." "I know," Hermione said, voice carefully controlled. "Also," Harry said, "your layered charm idea this morning genuinely worked, better than my method." Hermione looked up at him. Her eyes were bright. "You're trying to distract me," she said. "Is it working?" A pause, then slightly broken. "A little bit, yes." Ron appeared with 3 mugs of hot chocolate that he'd gotten from somewhere in the kitchen, which was a skill Harry hadn't known he had, and which turned out to be one of many practical Weasley competencies that rarely came up in a classroom context. He handed them around and sat on the floor in front of the fire with his legs crossed and his hands around his mug and said, without looking at either of them, "I'm glad you're both all right." Hermione and Harry both said nothing. But something settled between the 3 of them in that firelit room, easy and certain, the way stones settle after waters moved through. It was the end of October. There were 7 months left of the year. Harry thought, these are the people. He was right and he knew it, the way he knew rooms and wands and the magic that had been his only companion for 7 years. He knew it in the same clean-lined way he knew everything, certainly, specifically, without apology. He went to find the door on the 3rd floor the next morning. Hermione and Ron came with him. He hadn't asked them to. He told them what he'd been thinking about Quirrell, the corridor, the cold thing, the stone at breakfast, laying it out in logical sequence the way he did everything, and before he'd got to the end Ron said, "So we need to look at the door," and Hermione said, "The protections you mentioned, do you know whose spellwork you didn't recognize?" And neither of them suggested not going because that was the kind of people they were. Harry thought he ought to have found them sooner. The corridor was empty on a Sunday morning, the 3rd floor landing deserted. Harry stood in front of the door and ran his awareness over the protections layer by layer, and Hermione stood next to him taking quiet notes, and Ron stood behind them watching the corridor with the relaxed alertness of someone who had 6 brothers and had spent his childhood knowing when something was coming. 6 distinct layers, Harry said. McGonagall, Flitwick, Sprout, and 3 I haven't identified yet. The unidentified 3, Hermione said. Could one of them be Snape? Harry thought about Snape, about his magic precise layered with a quality of things unsaid underneath everything. Maybe, he said. One of the 3 has that quality, dense, intentional, he paused. One of them is very old, pre-modern spellwork. How old? Centuries. He thought about the intention he'd felt on the deepest layer, the old tired hoping. Possibly 4 or 5. And the cold trace, Hermione said. Quirrells, it's looking for gaps. Yes, Harry stood back from the door. It's patient, but it's not just waiting, it's mapping. Each time it comes here, it's testing a different protection, working through the sequence. Looking for the weakest one, Ron said from behind them. Looking for the one with the most exploitable flaw, Harry said. Those aren't always the same. Ron nodded. He had a good instinct for strategy. Harry had noticed, not the technical strategy of chess, though he was brilliant at chess, but the wider kind, the reading the room kind. He understood motivation in a way that Harry understood mechanics. They were, in that sense, very complementary. If Quirrell reaches it, Hermione said, what happens if the stone is what you think it is? Harry thought about the cold thing in Quirrell, about its hunger and its patience and its diminishment. Someone comes back who shouldn't, he said, and comes back stronger than they were before. The corridor was quiet. So we stop him, Ron said, not a question, not bravado either, just the simple statement of the thing that had to happen, delivered in the same tone Ron used to say pass the pumpkin juice. This was one of the things Harry had come to depend on in Ron without fully articulating it until now, his clarity. He didn't complicate things that were actually simple. We stop him, Harry said. Do we tell Dumbledore? Hermione asked. Harry had been thinking about this. Dumbledore put this here, he said. He knows it's here, he knows Quirrell's here, he may already know what's in Quirrell. He looked at the door. I think he's letting this play out. Why? Hermione asked. Because whatever's inside Quirrell has a target, Harry said, and I think Dumbledore's using the stone to draw it. A pause. You think we're bait? Ron said. I think I'm bait, Harry said. I don't think that was the plan for you too. Neither Ron nor Hermione said anything to this. Then Hermione said briskly, well, that's Dumbledore's plan. Not ours, she closed her notebook. We should learn the protections properly. If we're going to help when this comes to a head, we need to know what we're working with. Agreed, Harry said. I'll research the historical texts for pre-modern locking charms, she said. That might tell us what the oldest protection is. I'll work on Quirrell, Ron said. Harry and Hermione both looked at him. Not directly, Ron said with mild offense. I mean watching him, patterns when he goes to the corridor, at what times, what he does before and after. You can learn a lot about what something's planning by watching its habits. He shrugged. Fred and George taught me that, surveillance, he said. They call it market research. Harry looked at him, then he smiled, the real one. That's good, he said. That's actually very good. Ron looked briefly self-conscious and then squared it away. Obviously, he said. They walked back from the corridor together, and Harry felt the weight of what they'd taken on settle into him the way the cold had settled into the stones of the castle, not heavy exactly, just present and real and clear. Outside, through a narrow window in the stairwell, the grounds were gray and still, and the forest was dark at the edge, keeping its own counsel. The castle around him was warm and alive with its old patient awareness, and Harry felt it noticed the 3 of them in the corridor the way it had noticed him alone before, with something that wasn't quite recognition, but was close. He put his hand flat against the stone wall for a moment. The castle thought back, slow and vast. I know, Harry thought, I'm working on it. He caught up with Ron and Hermione on the stairs, and the 3 of them went down toward the warmth of the Great Hall and whatever Sunday offered, and Harry moved through the morning with the clean-lined certainty of someone who has looked at a problem from every angle and found to their satisfaction that they can solve it. The question was only when. He was patient. He had been patient his entire life. He could be patient a little longer. Chapter 4. The mirror and the stone. November became December, the way all bad ideas become inevitable, gradually, and then all at once. The cold that had been a suggestion in October became a fact in November, and by the first week of December it was the kind of cold that didn't ask permission, that came through stone walls and found you regardless of how many fires were lit, that turned the lake to a flat black mirror each morning and put ice along the windowsills of the dormitory that Harry would melt each night with a thought because he found it easier to sleep without the draft. The grounds white. The forest went very dark against the snow. The castle settled deeper into itself, the way old things do in winter, drawing its heat inward. Harry had been wrong about one thing. He'd thought Dumbledore was letting the situation with Quirrell play out, and he still thought that, but he'd underestimated how actively Dumbledore was managing him specifically. The realization came in pieces, the way most realizations came to Harry, not as a sudden revelation, but as the slow accumulation of small, precise observations that eventually reached critical mass. It started with the defense against the dark arts classes. Quirrell's teaching was objectively poor. Harry had known this since September. The content was thin, the theory shoddy, the practical exercises were years behind what they ought to be for students with basic magical education. But in late November, the classes took on a different quality. Quirrell started including exercises that were quietly targeted: shield charms under pressure, identification of concealed magical objects, detection of foreign intent. All framed in the language of standard curriculum, all pointing at a specific set of skills, the skills you'd need if you were walking into a trap. Harry did the exercises. He did them well without appearing to do them exceptionally, the careful, deliberate average he'd maintained all year. And he watched Quirrell teach them and felt the cold thing behind Quirrell's eyes occasionally surface and look at the class with an attention that was not a teacher's attention. It looked at Harry most. Harry looked back in the peripheral way, showing nothing. The second piece was Dumbledore in the corridors. Harry had worked out by October that Dumbledore moved through Hogwarts on a pattern that was not random, and that pattern had changed in the last month. The headmaster appeared at the edges of things more, at the end of corridors when Harry had been somewhere interesting, at the top of a staircase when Harry came up it late from the library, once sitting quietly in an alcove off the fourth-floor landing reading a book with the specific quality of someone who is choosing to be noticed, not following Harry. Not obvious about it, but there, testing Harry thought what he'd do if he knew he was being watched. What Harry did was nothing different, which was the correct answer, and also, he thought, not the answer Dumbledore had expected. The third piece was the conversation. December 3rd, after Transfiguration. Harry had stayed to ask McGonagall about an advanced animagus theory question. He'd been reading animagus theory purely out of interest, not intending to attempt it at 11. The ethical dimensions were complex and the process was long, and when he came out of the classroom, Dumbledore was in the corridor. Not pretending to be doing something else this time. Just standing there, blue eyes bright in a face like a benevolent cliff face, half-moon glasses, that extraordinary magic pressing against the air like weather. "Harry," Dumbledore said, "not Mr. Potter, Harry." "Professor Dumbledore," Harry said, and waited. Dumbledore looked at him with the particular attention of someone who has been thinking about you for longer than you know and said, "I wonder if you'd walk with me." Harry walked with him. The route Dumbledore chose went up, through two moving staircases and a corridor Harry knew eventually wound back toward the 7th floor. He filed this and said nothing about it. "Professor McGonagall tells me your transfiguration work is remarkable," Dumbledore said. He said it conversationally, not as an opener. "She's a very good teacher," Harry said. "The material gives me a lot to work with." "Indeed," a pause during which Dumbledore looked at the middle distance with an expression of peaceful interest. "I understand you've also been spending some time on other floors, the library primarily, but not exclusively." Harry looked at him. "The castle's interesting," he said. "I like to know how things work. A fine quality." Another pause. "You know, Harry, Hogwarts has secrets that are best encountered with guidance. Some areas of the castle can be confusing, even dangerous for those who come across them without context." "I appreciate the concern," Harry said. "I tend to be careful." "I have no doubt," Dumbledore said, and his voice was warm and very intelligent, and Harry noted that warm and very intelligent were not the same as honest, though they weren't incompatible either. "May I ask what it is you've been working out in your wanderings?" Harry thought about this for several steps. He decided on honesty. Not complete honesty. He wasn't going to give Dumbledore his full model of Quirrell, not yet, not until he understood what Dumbledore knew and what he was doing with it. But honest in the way that respected the intelligence of the person he was talking to. "There's something wrong with Quirrell," Harry said. Dumbledore walked for a moment without responding. "What makes you say that?" he said. "His magic is wrong," Harry said. "There's something underneath it that isn't his, something old and cold that's using him." He paused. "It wants something that's behind the door on the 3rd floor. It's been mapping the protection since September." The corridor was quiet except for footsteps. "That is," Dumbledore said, "a remarkably precise observation." "It's fairly obvious if you're paying attention," Harry said. "I'm sure I'm not the only one who's noticed." Dumbledore's eyes were on him, not the warm general interest, the direct version, the one that looked like it was used rarely but looked at things thoroughly. "What do you intend to do about it?" he asked. "That depends," Harry said, "on what you're already doing." Silence. They'd reached the 7th floor. Harry stopped. He was standing in the corridor with the blank wall because Dumbledore had brought him here. He turned and looked at the headmaster, who was watching him with an expression that was complex enough that Harry could read most of its layers, but not quite the deepest one. The deepest one was something old and sad and certain, which was a combination Harry filed carefully. "You're quite extraordinary, Harry," Dumbledore said, and meant it, and Harry could feel that he meant it, which was one of the more unsettling things about Dumbledore. His sincerity was real even when his methods weren't straightforward. "Tell me what's behind the door," Harry said. "Something very old and very valuable," Dumbledore said, "being kept safe. From Quirrell, from what's in him." "Yes, and what is it?" Harry asked. "In him." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Something that was thought to be gone, that has spent 10 years looking for a way back." He paused. "And that has, I believe, spent the last 2 months looking at you." "I know," Harry said. "I've let it." Dumbledore was quiet. Harry could feel the quality of his attention shift. It was like a lens adjusting, focusing at a different depth. You've been letting it look, Dumbledore said slowly, deliberately. The best way to understand something is to let it study you and watch what it pays attention to, Harry said. I wanted to know what it was looking for. And what is it looking for? In me? Harry thought about the cold thing's attention, those moments of surface contact over the weeks. It's looking for weakness, for fear, for the thing that'll break. He met Dumbledore's eyes. It hasn't found any. Dumbledore looked at him for a very long time. No, he said quietly, I don't suppose it has. They stood in the 7th floor corridor, and Harry felt the castle around them attending in its slow geological way, and the blank wall pulsed once very softly at the edge of his awareness. The protections will hold, Dumbledore said, but there was something underneath the certainty that Harry could hear, not doubt exactly, but awareness of contingency. Things that could go wrong. Gaps he'd calculated and decided to risk. Which one won't? Harry asked. Dumbledore smiled, and it was a real smile, and it was also the smile of someone who wasn't going to answer that question, which was itself an answer. I think, Dumbledore said, that if anything were to go wrong, you would be more useful knowing less of what I know, so that you could surprise things that otherwise might not be surprised. That's a very polite way of not telling me things, Harry said. I am a very polite man, Dumbledore said pleasantly. Harry looked at him. He was not afraid of Dumbledore. He was not afraid of anyone, had not been since approximately age 9, but he had a clear-eyed understanding of what Dumbledore was. A very powerful person who was very used to being the cleverest one in any situation, who had plans within plans, and who had made decisions about Harry's role in this before Harry had ever arrived at the school. There was genuine warmth in him and genuine care. There was also the absolute certainty of someone who had decided the ends were worth the means, which was the kind of certainty Harry found most worth watching. If the protections break, Harry said, I'm going in. Harry, I'm not asking, Harry said, not unkindly. I'm telling you what's going to happen so you can plan around it. He paused. I expect you already have. Dumbledore looked at him across the 7th floor corridor, and something moved in his eyes that Harry couldn't quite name. It was adjacent to grief and adjacent to pride and was neither. Do be careful, Dumbledore said and walked away. Harry stood for a moment, then he put his hand flat against the blank wall and thought at it. The room of requirement opened. He'd been visiting it for 3 weeks since the castle had first shown it to him. The room had been in those visits a library extraordinary and vast, full of texts that didn't exist in the physical Hogwarts library or anywhere in the physical world he'd been able to access, books from private collections and sealed archives in places he hadn't known he'd be able to get to. He'd spent hours in there every session. He thought the room might be his favorite thing about Hogwarts, and Hogwarts had an embarrassment of candidates. Today the room was different, not a library. He stood in it for a moment, looking at what it had decided to be, and felt the castle's quiet intentionality in the choice. It was a practice space, high-ceilinged, stone-floored, lit by sources he couldn't identify, with the particular acoustic quality of a room that had been designed for work. And in the center of the room, on a stone platform, was a mirror. Tall, ornate, with a gold frame and clawed feet, and an inscription across the top in a language that wasn't quite Latin but had Latin's bones. He walked toward it slowly and read the inscription, Eris stra eru oit ube kafruoid on wosi. He read it backwards, I show not your face but your heart's desire. He stood in front of the mirror of Eris and looked. He saw himself first, but the version in the mirror was not alone. Around him were figures, warm and solid and real, and it took him a moment to parse them because he had so little reference for what he was looking at. A woman with red hair and green eyes exactly like his, or he had hers, who was looking at the mirror Harry with an expression of such unguarded love that it made his chest contract. A man beside her with dark hair and glasses, and a familiar quality in the jaw and the set of the shoulders, resting a hand on mirror Harry's shoulder with the easy assurance of someone who touches people they love easily, who has never had to think about whether it's allowed. And around them, vaguer but present, the sense of more, a wider warmth, the texture of a family that extended. Harry looked at this for a long moment, then he looked away. He sat down on the floor in front of the mirror, cross-legged, facing away from it, and thought about the inscription, Your Heart's Desire. He noted what his was, considered it carefully, and then filed it in the category of things that were real and true and couldn't be acted on directly, but which it was important to know about yourself. He thought, I have 2 people who are alive. I have Ron and Hermione. Then he thought, this mirror could be a problem. Not for him, he'd looked and looked away. He could do that. He'd been doing the equivalent of that his whole life, managing want without being managed by it. But for someone less practiced, someone who had more hunger and less discipline, it could be a trap. He turned back to face it. You're here for a reason, he said to the mirror, not a question. The mirror reflected him, cross-legged on the floor, and behind him in the image the figures of his parents. And it did not answer because mirrors didn't answer. But Harry had an instinct, the same instinct that had told him about the room's intentionality, about the castle's attention, that he was right. This mirror was here because it would be important. He thought about Dumbledore's non-answer, about the protections and the gaps, about the thing inside Quirrell spending months mapping the path to the stone. He thought the last protection, the one Dumbledore won't tell me about. He looked at the mirror. He thought he understood. He stood, memorized the room exactly as it was, and left. Christmas came. Most of the school left for the holidays, including Ron, who invited Harry to the burrow with the open, uncomplicated generosity that Harry was still learning to receive without deflecting. Harry thanked him and declined, which he knew Ron didn't entirely understand. He stayed because he needed the access. A mostly empty school was 3 weeks of having the corridors to himself, the library unrestricted in the small hours, the castle's attention undivided. He had things to work through that required time and quiet, and the holiday offered both. The first thing he worked through was the protections. He needed to know each one completely, not to break them, but to understand what would be needed to get through if the situation demanded it. He stood at the third-floor door each night and felt each layer with the careful, analytical attention he brought to everything, building a map of the structure. It took him 6 nights to get it right, and on the 7th night he was satisfied and walked away. McGonagall's lair, a life-size animated chess set in the room beyond, he could feel its pieces from outside the door. He wasn't a chess player in the tournament sense, but the logic of chess was straightforward. Ron would have been better for this one. Flitwick's, a logic puzzle probably potions-based. Hermione would have been better for this one. Sprouts, Devil's Snare, he could feel the plant's aggressive magical signature through the stone, that particular botanical defensiveness. Easy if you kept your head. A fourth he identified as a flying key room, some kind of enchanted obstacle course. His clearly Snape's potion logic, Hermione's again, the sixth protection, the oldest one, the mirror. He sat in the corridor on the 7th night and thought about what that meant. The mirror required you to look at it and see the thing you most wanted and not be consumed by wanting it. As a final protection, it was either brilliantly simple or completely inadequate, depending entirely on the nature of the person facing it. Against Voldemort, because he'd settled into using the name, had read Dumbledore's own notes in the library and decided the name was just letters. Fear of letters was not something he had time for, it was brilliantly simple. Voldemort wanted the stone, he would see himself with it. And someone who could only see themselves possessing a thing could never be the one to actually possess it, which meant the stone could only be retrieved by someone who wanted to find it but didn't want to use it. Harry made himself think about this very carefully. He wanted to find it to protect it. He did not want to use it. The mirror, therefore, would show him the stone in his hand, which meant he would actually have it, which meant it was a protection against possession but would not prevent him from taking it if he needed to. Dumbledore had planned for a specific kind of person to be able to get through. Harry fit that description exactly. He thought about whether this was intentional and decided it was, and decided that sitting with that was going to take some time. The Christmas holidays also gave him an unexpected gift, which arrived on Christmas morning with the rest of his presents. A thin, shimmering package with no note, and inside it a cloak of extraordinary material, silvery and weightless, that when he put it on showed him nothing below the collar. He was invisible. He held it for a while, feeling the magic in the fabric. Ancient work, extraordinarily skilled. There was something in the construction that was different from standard disillusionment, something that didn't just bend light around him but actually excluded him from the attention of watching things, magical or otherwise. He'd been doing a version of this since he was 6 wandlessly, but this was a different mechanism and he respected it. There was a note with it, which he'd put aside while examining the cloak and only read now. Neat handwriting. Your father left this in my keeping, use it well. Harry thought about that for a while, then he put the cloak on because it seemed rude not to and went for a walk. He found something he hadn't expected, the mirror out of the room, relocated apparently to a different classroom on the 4th floor. And in front of it, wrapped in a different invisibility cloak, older, heavier, less sophisticated, was Dumbledore. Harry stood absolutely still. Dumbledore was looking at the mirror with an expression Harry had not seen on his face before. All the warmth and the patience and the pleasant benevolence were gone, stripped away, and what was underneath was something that Harry recognized immediately because he'd worn it himself for years: loneliness. The specific kind that comes from being exceptional among the people you love. The loneliness of seeing further than the people around you and not being able to stop. Dumbledore stood in front of the Mirror of Erised, and whatever he saw in it was his own secret, and he was alone with it in what he'd thought was an empty castle. And the expression on his face in this unguarded moment was the expression of a man carrying something very heavy for a very long time. Harry left without making a sound. He thought about this all the way back to the Gryffindor Tower and through Christmas dinner and into the evening, and he arrived at a conclusion that revised his model of Dumbledore in a way that made it simultaneously more complicated and more human. Dumbledore was not simply certain. He was certain and lonely and had made choices he lived with and was still making choices with the same quality of certainty that had made the earlier ones. He had looked into this mirror, which meant he had desires that were unmet, which meant he understood loss in a way that informed how he moved through the world, even when that movement used other people as pieces. Understanding someone's wound didn't make their choices correct, but it made the choices legible. Harry thought, I will be careful with him, and I will not be managed by him. Both of those things simultaneously. January brought the cold to its peak and brought the students back and brought something else, a shift in the quality of Quirrell's presence in the school. Harry felt it immediately the first week back. The cold thing in Quirrell had been patient and methodical all term, mapping the protections, probing for gaps, working through its approach with the careful deliberateness of something that has time on its hands. In January, the patience changed. It became urgency, still controlled, still intelligent, but with something underneath it that wasn't quite desperation and wasn't quite fear but was their cousin, the urgency of something running out of runway. He mentioned this to Hermione and Ron on a Tuesday in the library. Running out of runway how? Ron asked. Quirrell's body, Harry said. It's not built for what's living in it. I can feel the strain in his magic. It's like the housing is starting to fail. He paused. Which means whatever's in there needs to move soon. It needs the stone soon, or it needs to find another way, and there isn't another way. Hermione looked up from the text she'd been using to identify the pre-modern locking charm on the 6th protection layer. So it's going to accelerate, she said. Yes. When? Before June, Harry said. Probably before spring. He thought about the quality of urgency he'd felt. Maybe sooner. Ron's surveillance report on Quirrell, which he'd been maintaining in a small green notebook since November with the methodical dedication of someone who had grown up in a family where information was currency, was spread on the table between them. Dates, times, routes. Ron had noticed 3 things that Harry hadn't known. Quirrell visited the 3rd floor corridor most often on nights after staff meetings, which suggested he was timing his visits around when the staff were distracted and accounted for. He had a second route he used when he came back through the trophy room rather than the direct corridor that Ron thought was deliberate misdirection. And twice in December he had gone somewhere else entirely at 3 in the morning, a direction that led, on the map Ron had drawn, toward the edge of the Forbidden Forest. The forest, Harry said, looking at the map. He went to the edge of it, Ron said, twice. Why the forest? Unicorns, Hermione said, and both Harry and Ron looked at her, and she looked back with the expression of someone who has done more reading than anyone asked for and is pleased about it. I was researching what a weakened dark entity might use as a temporary power source while seeking a permanent one. Unicorn blood. It sustains life, even a half-life. It's in Fantastic Beasts and several of the darker herbology texts. She paused. Someone's been killing unicorns in the forest. Firenze told a 3rd-year Gryffindor who wandered in last term. Harry thought about this. A creature surviving on unicorn blood, diminished and patient, living inside a failing human host working toward the stone. The shape of it was becoming very clear. He's keeping Voldemort alive, Harry said, while Voldemort maps the way to the stone, and when Voldemort's confident he can get through, they'll go. We need to be there before them, Ron said. We need to know exactly when they're going, Hermione said. I'll know, Harry said. He looked at the green notebook, then at both of them. When the urgency changes to decision, when I feel him make the choice to move, there'll be a shift. I'll feel it before he goes. You can feel his intention, Hermione said. I can feel his magic's quality, Harry said. It's not legilimency, I'm not reading his thoughts. But intention changes magic, it changes the shape of it. When someone decides to do something, the magic changes. He paused. It's like the difference between someone who is about to hit you and someone who is angry but hasn't decided yet. Ron looked at him. You've had enough people about to hit you that you can feel the difference, he said. Not quite a question. Dudley was educational, Harry said. Ron nodded with the particular understanding of a boy who'd grown up with 6 brothers. All right, he said, so you'll know when you know we go. We, Harry said. We, Ron and Hermione said simultaneously in the tone of people who have already had this argument and won it. Harry looked at both of them. Then he looked down at the table and allowed himself a moment of something that wasn't sentimentality but was adjacent to it, which he immediately filed and moved on from. All right, he said. We, February, March, April. The year moved with a momentum now, pulling toward its conclusion the way rivers pull toward the sea. Harry went to classes and played Quidditch. Gryffindor beat Hufflepuff in February. He caught the snitch in 5 minutes because there'd been rain and the visibility was poor, and he'd been tracking the snitch's avoidance patterns through the weather rather than visually. And spent evenings with Ron and Hermione in the common room, doing homework and not doing homework in roughly equal measure, and went to the room on the 7th floor 3 nights a week and worked. He worked through things he hadn't had time to finish before school. A complete analysis of the protection layers, a theoretical framework for what would be needed if the battle went badly, specific spell work he hadn't needed until now. Counter curses for possession, which were specialized and not in any school text, which he'd found in a grimoire in the room's library. Protections against legilimency, the cold thing had been pushing at the surface of his mind more recently, and he'd been letting it find nothing, but he refined his defenses further. If Voldemort broke free of Quirrell and came at him directly, he wanted to be ready. He also, in these sessions, worked through something personal. He had not looked at the mirror again. He'd made his peace with what it showed him and put it where it belonged, real, true, a thing he knew about himself. Filed under what I want rather than what I have. which was a distinction he'd made his whole life about most things. But he thought about his parents more in these months than he had in years, not with sadness exactly, with the specific quality of wanting to have known something that was gone before you got there. His mother's eyes in the mirror, that unguarded love. His father's hand on his shoulder. He thought about a man who had died at 21, who had been his age plus 10 years, who had left behind a son who had turned out to be this. He thought about what his father might have said about all of it. He thought his father probably would have been delighted about the Quidditch. He thought his mother would have had opinions about the Quirrell situation that would have been both loving and terrifying. He went back to his work. May arrived. The urgency in Quirrell's magic sharpened to something close to a point. Harry was in charms when he felt it, sitting between Ron and Hermione, supposed to be doing a summoning charm exercise, and the shift happened across the castle like a door opening in a room 2 floors up, subtle and clear, and he sat up straighter, and Ron noticed immediately because he'd been watching Harry for signs of this for months. When Ron said in an undertone, "Tonight," Harry said in an undertone, Hermione's quill stopped moving. She looked at him across the exercise. "Tonight," she said. "He's decided," Harry said. "The quality changed, it's done thinking, it's doing." He looked at Flitwick, who was helping a Hufflepuff boy with his summoning grip and was not paying attention to the back row. "He'll go after dinner when the castle's settled." "So do we go after dinner?" Ron said. "Before him," Harry said. "I need to be in position before he arrives." Position in the Hermione stopped herself from saying third floor corridor audibly. "That position? Yes." She closed her charms book. "All right," she said. She opened it again because there were still 40 minutes of class left and she was still Hermione, and completed her exercise with a focus that Harry thought was admirable. Ron did his exercise with less focus but still did it, because Ron was practical about things that needed doing. Harry did his exercise and barely noticed, because his attention was elsewhere, tracing and retracing the route through the protections, running scenarios, thinking. They ate dinner quickly. The Great Hall was normal around them, the noise and the color, the candles, the early summer sky through the ceiling turning from blue to gold as the sun went. It was the most ordinary scene imaginable, and Harry sat in it and ate, and looked at everything with the clean, precise attention he brought to things he was aware might be the last time, which was not pessimism but accuracy. You never knew. He looked at the Gryffindor table, the warm noise of it. He looked at the high table, Dumbledore watching the room with his pleasant, all-seeing expression. He looked at Quirrell, sitting very still and eating nothing, and felt the decision in him like a pulled bow. They left dinner early and went to the third-floor corridor. Harry stopped in front of the door. He turned to face Ron and Hermione, who were standing behind him with the identical expression of people who have decided something and are committed to it. "You don't have to come past this door," Harry said. "We know," Ron said. "Inside it's at minimum a chess game, a logic problem, a flying key room, devil's snare." "We know," Hermione said. "We've been over it. And beyond all of that," Harry, Ron said. "Open the door." Harry looked at them both for a moment. Then he turned, put his hand against the door, felt the 6 layers of protection against his awareness like 6 distinct voices, and pushed. Not with the wand. With the Wandless, the 7 years of self-taught certainty that lived in his sternum. He said something in the old form of Latin, the layered phrase that addressed not the spell but the intention of the spell, and the protections heard it and recognized the shape of what he was, wanted to protect, not to use, wanted to guard, not to take, and the door opened. They went in. Devil's snare first. The room below the trapdoor was dark and the plant came for them immediately, the way it always came for things, automatic and fast, and Harry lit the room without the wand and the plant recoiled and they were through. The flying keys were locked in a room that hummed with their motion, hundreds of them, all bespelled and darting. Harry felt the room in one extended moment, tracked every key simultaneously, and the one they needed, the large, old, silver one with the crumpled wing, was in the upper left quadrant doing irregular laps. He did not get on a broom. He reached out, stopped it in the air, brought it to his hand, and unlocked the door. "You could have done that from the other side of the corridor," Ron said. "Yes," Harry said. "Then why did we?" "I needed to see if there was anything else in these rooms," Harry said. "There isn't, come on." The chess room was McGonagall's. It was magnificent and it was enormous, and the pieces were alive in the way that Harry's Morning Sparrow constructs were alive, animated intelligence, genuine tactical awareness, and the white pieces were already in formation, waiting. There was a chessboard the size of a great hall in a room barely big enough to contain it. Ron stood at the edge and looked at it. "We need to play our way through," Harry said. "Yes," Ron said, and there was a different quality in his voice now. The quality of someone who has found the room that was made for them. He studied the board with the still, total focus that Harry had only seen Ron give to 2 other things, food and people he was worried about. "Black pieces," he said. "We're black, you 2 are bishops, I'm a knight." He walked onto the board without hesitation and Harry and Hermione followed, and the white pieces moved first and Ron began to play. What happened in the next 15 minutes was the most instructive thing Harry had watched all year. Ron played chess the way Harry did magic, not by thinking about the moves but by reading the game, the whole game, the shape of it rather than the position of each piece. He moved Harry and Hermione with quiet, specific directions. "Forward 2, don't take the pawn, he's bait. Wait." And Harry, who had been used to making his own decisions at every step since he was 4 years old, followed Ron's directions without question because Ron was right and Harry could see that he was right. He filed this, 15 minutes. The White Queen was down. The path through the board was clear. Ron was standing by a white rook that had taken his knight 3 moves ago, and he was very pale and he had a cut above his eye from where he'd hit the floor, and he looked at the clear path and then at Harry. "Through," he said, "both of you." "You're coming," Harry said. "Harry, I need someone to go back and send an owl to Dumbledore," Harry said. "That's why you're going back, not because you can't come through, because someone needs to." Ron looked at him. He understood. He also, Harry could tell, suspected this was partially Harry making sure Ron was safe, and he was right, but it was also operationally true. Someone needed to tell Dumbledore. "Be careful," Ron said. "I'm always careful," Harry said. "You put yourself between a 1,200-pound troll, and that was very careful," Harry said. "I thought about it beforehand." Ron almost smiled. "Go," he said. Before the board resets, Harry looked at Hermione. "Together," she said, "they went through. The logic puzzle was Snape's 6 bottles on a stone table, a parchment with a riddle in Snape's precise handwriting, 2 doors." Harry read the riddle once. It was a good riddle, genuinely elegant, the kind of thing that required not just logic but a particular kind of close reading of language. He thought it was characteristic of Snape in a way that made it interesting. Snape had built his protection around the assumption that the person trying to solve it would be impatient. Hermione solved it in 3 minutes. She picked the right bottle, the small round one, and held it out to Harry with steady hands. He looked at it. "I go forward," he said. "You take the other bottle and go back to Ron." "Harry, what's past this door has Voldemort in it," Harry said, and the name sat in the air between them without drama, just a name. "I need you safe, not because you can't handle things, you can handle anything, but because if this goes badly, someone needs to tell the story correctly." Hermione looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were bright and dry, which was the Hermione version of fighting something hard. "Don't die," she said. "I have a very low tolerance for dying," Harry said. "That's not," she stopped. Then she put her arms around him, briefly, fierce and certain, and he stood still for a moment and then put one arm around her shoulders back. And it lasted 3 seconds, and then she stepped away and straightened her robes and picked up the return bottle with both hands. "Tell the story right," Harry said. "Always," she said. He drank the forward bottle. He went through the last door. The room beyond was not what he'd expected, and he'd expected several things. It was small and stone, and there was a fire, and there was the mirror of Arist against the far wall, and it was already lit as though it had been waiting. And standing in front of it was Quirrell, looking into its face with the concentrated desperation of someone who has been looking for something for a very long time. Quirrell heard him. He turned. "Potter," he said, and it was not quite Quirrell's voice anymore. It was 2 voices, one over the other, and the cold one underneath was interested in a way that was very old and very awake. "I had wondered if it might be you. I've been wondering the same about tonight," Harry said and looked at the mirror. "It won't give you the stone." Quirrell's eyes tightened. "You know about the mirror." "I figured it out in December," Harry said. "The final protection is the one that only shows you the stone if you don't want to use it. You'll only ever see yourself with it, you'll never actually have it." Quirrell stared at him. The cold thing underneath rose slightly, pressing against the surface. "Unless," said the voice that was not Quirrell's, "someone else uses the mirror." And the fire went out. Chapter 5. What remains? The fire went out and the room went dark except for the mirror, which gave off its own light, not warm, not cold, something in between, the light of something that had been looking at people for centuries and had developed an opinion about what it saw. Harry stood in it and looked at Quirrell. Quirrell looked back, and behind his eyes the cold thing looked back too, and Harry could feel it now without any distance or management, full and direct, pressing against the air of the small stone room like a hand against a window. It was the most ancient thing he'd ever felt. Not old the way the castle was old, patient and steady and full of long decisions. Old the way something is old when it has survived things it shouldn't have survived, when it has scraped itself through gaps that should have killed it, when it has spent so long refusing to be gone that refusing has become the whole of its personality. It was also, Harry noted, afraid, not of the room or the protections or the mirror, of him. Specifically of him, which it was covering with the kind of aggression that fear puts on when it can't afford to look like fear. Harry found this useful. "You shouldn't be here, Potter," Quirrell said, and the 2-voice quality had settled. Quirrell mostly, Voldemort underneath and listening. "You can't understand what's at stake." "Tell me," Harry said, not a challenge, genuine curiosity. Quirrell blinked. Whatever he'd been prepared for, it wasn't that. "You're not frightened," Quirrell said. "No," Harry said, "you should be." "Probably," Harry agreed. "But I spent 11 years alone with nothing but magic and books, and you'd be surprised what stops frightening you after a while." He looked at the mirror, then back. "He's been pushing at my mind for months. He knows I'm not afraid of him." "He wants to know why," said the voice from underneath, and this time it was just the cold voice, Quirrell's mouth moving around someone else's words, and Harry adjusted his assessment of the division of control. Quirrell was a host, willing but not fully subsumed. There was still a person in there, which was the saddest part of the whole thing. "Because fear requires uncertainty," Harry said. "I'm not uncertain." The cold voice was quiet for a moment. Then, "About what?" About this, Harry said. About tonight, about what happens when you try to take the stone. And what happens? The voice was genuinely curious, which was interesting. Voldemort did not have many people who would talk to him like this, Harry suspected, as an equal rather than a supplicant or an enemy. You don't get it, Harry said, and then you have to find another way to come back, which gets harder every time you fail, and eventually you run out of options. He paused. That's if you try to get through me. If you don't try to get through me, if you turn around right now, you buy yourself more time to find a better plan. You're giving me tactical advice, the cold voice said. I'm being honest about the situation, Harry said. I find it saves time. A pause. The mirror stood between them and slightly to Harry's left, and he could feel it doing what it did, watching, showing, reflecting the deepest want of anyone who looked at it. He had positioned himself carefully with his back partly to it, close enough that he could step in front of it if he needed to, far enough that he wasn't looking into it. Quirrell turned to face the mirror fully. Use the boy, the cold voice said, but not to Harry, to Quirrell, which meant there was something the cold thing couldn't do directly. Something it needed Quirrell's hands for. Harry filed this, the division of control mattered. Voldemort was the intelligence, but Quirrell was the body, and that division was a gap. Quirrell stepped toward Harry. Harry watched him come and did not move. He had thought about this moment since November, in the background of everything else, thought about what it would require, what he would need, what the specific demands of this specific situation were. Quirrell with Voldemort inside him was not a standard threat. You couldn't simply overpower it in the conventional sense because you were fighting on two levels simultaneously. The physical containment of Quirrell and the magical suppression of Voldemort, and they were different problems that required different solutions. He had worked out the solutions. He had worked out 3 of them in order of preference with contingencies. He let Quirrell get close. He let him get within arm's reach, which was close enough that he could feel the cold radiating off him, not metaphorical cold, actual cold, the magical cold of something that had no business being housed in a living body and was making the housing pay for it. Quirrell's face was beaded with sweat. His hands were shaking slightly, which Harry hadn't expected. He looked at the hands and realized this was not fear, this was physical deterioration. The body was failing faster than he'd estimated. Quirrell reached for Harry's face. Harry moved. Not away, sideways, and slightly forward, which was the direction you move when someone expects you to step back, and the element of surprise it generated was approximately 1 second, but 1 second was sufficient. He caught Quirrell's wrist with his left hand and with his right Wandless pressed his palm flat against the side of Quirrell's face. He pushed. Not a spell, the clean-lined intention, the hot coal feeling from when he was 4 but articulated now with 7 years of precision, and what he pushed was not force but the opposite. He pushed his own magic outward like breath, like warmth, like the opposite of everything that cold thing was, and against a creature that had spent years diminishing and surviving on blood and cruelty and borrowed life, the contrast was catastrophic. Quirrell screamed. Not Quirrell's scream, something underneath it, something old and stripped of all its patience and certainty, something that had been strong once and was not strong now and felt the difference. Harry held on, his hand burned. He could feel it burning, the cold fighting the warmth, and he kept the warmth steady and clear the way he kept everything steady and clear because steadiness was the thing, steadiness was the whole of it. Panic was the only thing that could actually stop him. The room went very wrong. The cold thing fought back, and it fought back the way cornered things fight, without strategy, just force, and the force was considerable, even diminished. Harry felt it hit his magical defenses like a wave, and his defenses held, but he felt them hold, which he hadn't felt since he was small, and he thought, there you are. There's the real measure of you. He pushed harder. What he was doing was not a spell from any book. It was the thing the magic wanted to do when it reached toward other living things, refined and directed and specifically shaped. He'd worked it out in the room over months, not from theory but from the inside, from knowing his own magic's nature well enough to articulate what it had always wanted to do. It was fundamentally connective rather than destructive, which was why it worked against something that was fundamentally parasitic. Contact, recognition, the simple insistence that something alive was here and was not moving. Quirrell crumbled. Not dramatically, not an explosion or a flash of light or any of the things the defense books described when they talked about dark entities being expelled. He just came apart, the way things come apart when the thing holding them together leaves, and he was on the floor and Harry was standing over him and the cold was in the air around them, just in the air, no longer housed. Harry straightened. The cold thing in the air was not gone. It was furious, and it was looking for somewhere to go, and its attention was on Harry with the full weight of something that has just lost everything it was counting on and has decided the person responsible should understand the magnitude of that. Harry felt the full force of Voldemort's attention and met it with exactly the same expression he'd used on Vernon Dursley at age 11, patient, clear, immovable. You have nothing, Harry thought, not as words exactly, as a shape. You have no body, you have no stone. You failed every layer of the plan tonight, and you can't take mine because I'm not afraid of you and I never will be. The attention came at him and he didn't move, and it broke against him the way water breaks against stone. Not because he was harder, but because he was simply there, fully and completely there, with no gap for fear to get into. The cold thing, Voldemort, diminished and furious and still frighteningly intelligent even in this state, made a choice. Harry felt it make the choice. The way he felt all decisions changed the quality of magic. And then Voldemort was gone through the ceiling and the stone room was just a stone room, and Harry was standing in it alone with the mirror and Quirrell crumpled on the floor. He stood for a moment, he let out a breath. He looked at his right hand, which had a burn across the palm in the shape of contact, and closed it. He could fix it later. He stepped up to the mirror of Arist and looked into it. In the reflection he saw himself, and in his reflected hand was a small red stone that caught the mirror's cold light. And then it was in his actual hand, warm and light, the Philosopher's Stone, the thing Flamel had made and Dumbledore had tried to hide and Voldemort had spent a year engineering a path toward, and he looked at it for a moment. He closed his fingers around it, then he turned and crouched next to Quirrell. Quirrell was breathing. Barely, and the quality of the breathing was poor, the body trying to maintain itself without whatever had been keeping it going, but he was alive. Harry checked his pulse with 2 fingers, assessed what he found, and made a decision. He put one hand carefully on Quirrell's shoulder and felt the damage extensive, the kind of long-term magical contamination that degraded cellular integrity, and thought about what could be fixed and what couldn't. He fixed what he could. It wasn't enough to fully repair, but it was enough to stabilize and enough to mean that Quirrell would survive long enough to reach medical care, which was the best Harry could offer and was more than Voldemort had left the man. He stood up. He put the stone in his pocket. He walked back through the protection rooms alone. The chess room was empty, Ron had gone, the board still mid-game, and Harry walked across it without the pieces bothering him, the game over, the spell released. The key room was still, the enchanted keys settled on their hooks, and Harry walked through without looking at them. The devil's snare was dormant and he went past without a light. He came up through the trapdoor and into the 3rd floor corridor and closed the door behind him. He was standing in the corridor when his legs decided that the evening had been eventful enough and buckled slightly, and he put a hand on the wall and breathed for a moment, not from injury. From the specific physical reaction of a body that has been running on focused intention for several hours and has only just been told it can stop. He sat down on the floor with his back against the wall. He stayed there for a moment in the quiet. The castle around him was still. The walls were warm stone and old magic, and he felt them the way he always did, the patient attention, the recognition. He put his palm flat against the floor. The castle thought back the way it always thought, slow, vast, certain, but different tonight. Warmer, maybe. Or he was different tonight and noticing the warmth that had always been there. He sat on the floor of the 3rd floor corridor with the Philosopher's Stone in his pocket and his burned hand cooling against the stone floor. And for the first time since November, the background hum of the Quirrell situation was gone from the edges of his awareness. Just gone. The space where it had been was quiet, and the quiet was interesting. He hadn't realized how much of his attention had been occupied by it until it wasn't. He thought about Voldemort in the air above the room, that final moment of contact, the furious precision of that attention. He'd been right about one thing. It was the most powerful magical intelligence he'd ever encountered. Not the strongest raw force, his own magic was considerable and he knew it, but the most finely directed, the most thoroughly weaponized. A mind that had spent decades making itself into the sharpest possible instrument for a specific purpose. Extraordinary in its terrible way. And it had failed against a boy sitting on the floor of a corridor with a burned hand and good posture. He thought about that and found it confirmed something he'd believed since he was 8. Power in a straight line broke against things that were simply, completely present. The thing the cold couldn't understand was that Harry had never been performing. He wasn't brave in the active sense, wasn't overcoming fear. He genuinely, foundationally, was not afraid. Because 11 years alone in the dark with nothing but your own magic and your own thinking either makes you afraid of everything or afraid of nothing. And Harry had gone the second way so early it was structural. You can't frighten something that doesn't have the gap you need. He heard footsteps before he saw light, and the footsteps were deliberate and unhurried, and he looked up as Dumbledore came around the corner with a lamp, moving through the corridor with the particular quality Harry had identified in December, not pretending to be doing something else. Just coming. Dumbledore saw Harry on the floor and stopped. He looked at the stone corridor, the trapdoor barely visible in the ceiling, Harry sitting against the wall with his hand in his lap, and something moved through his expression that Harry couldn't quite read in the lamplight. "You're all right," Dumbledore said, not a question. "Mostly," Harry said. "Quirrell needs help, he's through there below the trapdoor. I stabilized him, but he needs proper medical attention." Dumbledore moved to the door without speaking, opened it with a gesture, and said something brief and precise into the room below. Then he closed it and turned back. He crossed the corridor and sat down, on the floor back against the opposite wall facing Harry. He arranged his robes around himself with the calm of someone who has decided on an action and is fully committed to it, and put the lamp between them and looked at Harry across the pool of its light with the expression Harry had seen in December in front of the mirror. All the performance gone, just the real thing underneath. "You went through," Dumbledore said. "Yes, all 6 protections." "Yes, alone. Hermione was with me to the 5th, Harry said. "I sent her back before the 6th. Ron went back after the chess room to send you an owl." Dumbledore nodded. He looked at Harry's hand. "May I?" Harry extended it. Dumbledore looked at the burn across the palm, the contact-shaped burn, the trace of what had happened, and his jaw tightened very slightly. He said a quiet word and the burn eased, not healed, but the pain reduced to manageable. He released Harry's hand with the gentleness of someone who is very used to having considerable power and choosing precisely how much of it to use. "The stone," Dumbledore said. Harry took it from his pocket and held it out. Dumbledore didn't take it immediately. He looked at it in Harry's palm with an expression that was complex, relief and grief and something conclusive, the expression of someone watching a chapter close. "I'll give it back to Nicholas," Dumbledore said. "He's agreed after tonight to have it destroyed." "Good," Harry said. "You've read about the stone." "I read about Flamelet 9, Harry said. "The stone was implicit in the biography. I just worked out the rest." Dumbledore took the stone, finally, and held it for a moment with the care of someone who knows exactly what they're holding and exactly what they're choosing to give up, and then put it into his robes. He looked at Harry. "I owe you an honest conversation," Dumbledore said. "You owe me several," Harry said without anger, "but I'll take one tonight." Dumbledore smiled at this briefly and genuinely. "You know that I knew what was in Quirrell," he said. "Yes. And that I knew what the situation was likely to become." "Yes. And you know that I arranged certain things." Dumbledore's voice was careful in the way that powerful people's voices are careful when they're being truthful about something that doesn't reflect well on them. "The stone here. The protections designed to be passable by the right person. The availability of certain objects." His eyes moved briefly to the shape of the cloak Harry hadn't brought with him, but which Dumbledore knew about. "You built a funnel," Harry said. "You put everything in one place. The thing Voldemort wanted, the tests Voldemort would have to pass, and a specific set of conditions that meant the person who got through would be someone who wanted to protect it rather than use it." He paused. "And you expected me to be that person." "I hoped," Dumbledore said, and it had the quality of a distinction he meant to draw precisely. "There's a difference between hoping and engineering," Harry said. "Yes," Dumbledore said, "there is. And I would be less than honest if I claimed I hadn't done both." The lamp burned between them. "Tell me about my parents," Harry said. He hadn't planned to say it tonight. But Dumbledore had said honest conversation, and Harry had decided to take him at his word. And the thing sitting behind everything else in his mind wasn't the stone or Quirrell or Voldemort in the air above the mirror room. It was the figures in the mirror, and the question he'd had since December about what he had the right to. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "Your father was," he began. "I know what the stories say," Harry said. "Tell me what you knew personally." Dumbledore looked at him across the lamp. Then he leaned back against the corridor wall and said plainly, like someone choosing not to perform, "James was brilliant and reckless and occasionally infuriating and entirely impossible not to love. He was funny in the way that people are funny when they're genuinely clever rather than just quick, and he was generous to a fault, and he made your mother work for it, which she never forgave him for, right up until she didn't have to anymore because they'd arrived somewhere that didn't require forgiveness." He paused. "He was 21 when he died. I think about that often," Harry breathed. "And your mother," Dumbledore said, "was the most naturally gifted witch I've taught in 60 years, and I include in that comparison a great many people who would be surprised to be outranked." He looked at Harry. "She had exactly what you have, that quality of presence, of being completely fully there. It's a rare thing. In her it was warm in a way that made people feel seen. In you it is," he considered the word, "foundational, like the stone of a building. Things can lean against it." Harry thought about Ron going back for the owl and Hermione with her arms around him for 3 seconds, fierce and certain. "She died to save you," Dumbledore said. "She didn't have to, she had seconds to choose and she chose. The magic of that choice is why Voldemort's curse failed that night. Old magic, the oldest kind, the kind that isn't in any book I've written, and I've written many, the kind that runs deeper than spellwork." He looked at Harry's forehead and the scar. "The protection she left in you, it's why Quirrell burned when he touched you tonight. Her sacrifice is threaded into your magic." Harry sat with this. He thought about what he'd done in the room, the push of warmth against cold, the specific quality of it, the way it had worked against Voldemort with a completeness he hadn't fully accounted for in his theoretical preparations. He'd thought it was his magic's nature. It was that. But it was also the other thing, the threaded thing, his mother's last choice made permanent in the structure of him. He thought, "I have been carrying her all this time." "Why didn't you tell me?" Harry asked. "Because," Dumbledore said, and here his voice had that something underneath it, the grief-adjacent thing, "I was not sure I could tell you without also telling you that I had plans for you that required you not to know certain things until certain times. And I did not want to mix those two conversations." He paused. "I still don't entirely, but you deserve more honesty than I've given you." "What plans?" Harry said, not a question exactly. More of a space he was offering. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. "Voldemort is not gone," he said. "Tonight set him back considerably. He'll need time, possibly years, to find another way back. But he'll find one. He is not finished." He paused. "There is a prophecy, Harry. It speaks of a boy with the power to defeat him. I believe you are that boy, although prophecy is a treacherous thing and I hold it less tightly than I once did." He looked at Harry over his half-moon glasses. What I hold more tightly is this: you are not defined by the prophecy, not by me, not by what happened when you were 1 year old. What you choose to be is what I choose to be, Harry said. Yes, Dumbledore said. Then we agree, Harry said. And for the record, if there's a prophecy, I'd like to read it, when that becomes relevant. Dumbledore looked at him. When it becomes relevant, he said, with something that might have been relief and might have been the first honest exchange between them that had been entirely free of management, you shall. They sat in the corridor for a few more minutes in silence, and it was comfortable, the way silence is comfortable when the thing underneath it has been named. The lamp burned, the castle breathed. Quirrell, Harry said. What happens to him? St. Mungo's first, Dumbledore said. Then I'll fight for leniency. He was not himself for some time, the extent to which the choice was his, he stopped. These are not simple questions. No, Harry said, but they're the right ones. Dumbledore looked at him. You have your mother's instinct for the right questions, he said. Harry stood up because his back was beginning to ache against the stone wall, and there was only so much gravitas a situation could sustain once that happened. He offered a hand to Dumbledore, who looked at it for a moment with an expression of brief surprise, and then took it. And Harry pulled him up with the casual ease of someone who is physically stronger than they appear. Dumbledore straightened his robes. The hospital wing, he said. Your hand. It's fine, Harry said. Harry. It's manageable, Harry said. I'll go in the morning. Tonight I want, he stopped. What do you want? Dumbledore asked, and the question was genuine, no subtext. Harry thought about it honestly. I want to find Ron and Hermione, he said. Dumbledore nodded. Then go, he said. I'll see to things here. Harry walked down the corridor and up the stairs, and the castle moved around him in its old, patient way, and he felt it as he always did, the warmth, the attention, the sense of a place that had been here for centuries and had decided to care about what happened in it. He went up 2 floors, and through a corridor and up a moving staircase, and through the portrait of the fat lady, who demanded the password with the air of someone who had been waiting up and was not happy about it. Mimbulus Mimbletonia, Harry said, which was the password this week, and she swung open with a disapproving energy. The common room was not empty. Ron was in the largest armchair by the fire with a blanket over his shoulders and a chess book open on his lap that he clearly hadn't been reading, and Hermione was on the hearthrug with her knees pulled up and her eyes on the fire. And they both looked up when Harry came through the portrait hole, and the look on their faces was the same look with different expressions underneath. Ron's was relief converted immediately into performed casualness. Hermione's was relief not converted into anything. There he is, Ron said. Harry crossed the room and sat on the rug next to Hermione and leaned against the armchair below Ron's feet and said nothing for a moment. How bad was it? Ron said. Managed, Harry said. The stone, Dumbledore has it, it's going to be destroyed. And Quirrell, alive, Harry said. Barely, he needs medical care. And Ron stopped, tried again. He's gone. Not gone, Harry said. Set back significantly. He looked at the fire. He'll come back eventually. Of course he will, Hermione said quietly. But not tonight, Harry said. Not tonight, she agreed. Ron's chess book closed with a soft sound. The fire crackled. The common room was warm and full of the deep quiet of a castle at 2 in the morning when everyone but 3 people is asleep. Tell us, Hermione said, so Harry told them. Not a report, a conversation. He told them about the room and the mirror and Quirrell's 2-layered voice, about Voldemort's attention and the choice he'd felt it make, about crouching over Quirrell on the stone floor and the burn on his palm and sitting in the corridor. He told them about Dumbledore on the floor of the 3rd floor corridor and the conversation, which he reported honestly, including the parts that were complicated. He told them about what Dumbledore had said about his mother. He told them this last part looking at the fire, not at them, and his voice stayed even because he'd had years of practice keeping his voice even. But Hermione reached over and put her hand briefly on his wrist, and Ron said nothing but shifted in the armchair so that his foot was resting against Harry's shoulder, companionable and grounding in the way that Ron's gestures always were practical, warm, not making a thing of it. Harry breathed. She sounds extraordinary, Hermione said. She was, Harry said. He paused. I didn't know her, but she's in me apparently, the magic of what she chose. That's not nothing, Ron said. No, Harry said, it's really not. They stayed by the fire until past 3. Ron fell asleep in the armchair in the way that people fall asleep when they've been holding themselves awake, and the reason to hold on is gone, suddenly and completely, the chess book sliding to the floor, his head dropping to the armchair's padded arm. Harry picked up the chess book and put it on the table beside him. Hermione was quiet for a while, then she said, I was frightened tonight, in the corridor waiting. I know, Harry said. I was frightened for you, she said, which is different from being frightened for myself. I don't entirely know what to do with that. Harry thought about it. I think you just do what you did, he said. Wait and be ready to catch the story if it goes wrong. You said that before, she said, telling the story right. It's important, he said. Why if it went wrong if you, she stopped. What does the story matter then? Harry thought carefully. Because whoever you are, he said, whatever happens, somebody being willing to tell your story means you mattered, that's all. Just that you were real and mattered and someone thought it worth saying. He paused. I grew up in a cupboard without anyone who thought I was worth noticing. The idea that you would notice, that you'd get it right, he stopped. Hermione was quiet for a moment. "That's the saddest thing you've ever said to me," she said. "It doesn't feel sad," Harry said. "It feels like the opposite." She looked at him. Then she pulled her knees tighter and looked at the fire. And they sat in the silence of the common room while the fire went from roaring to settled to embers, and Ron slept in his armchair, and the castle held them in its old patient way. The hospital wing was not Harry's favorite place, but Madame Pomfrey's displeasure at the state of his hand was bracing enough to be almost enjoyable. She healed it properly in 10 minutes and told him 3 times that wandless magic of that sustained intensity was not appropriate for first years. And Harry said yes and no and I understand and submitted to the bandaging with a patience she seemed to find suspicious. He was there for an hour. Ron came at visiting time with a packet of biscuits, the good kind, chocolate digestives, and sat on the end of the bed and said without preamble, "The whole school knows something happened." "What do they know?" Harry asked. "That you went through the 3rd floor corridor, that Quirrells and St. Mungo's, that Dumbledore came back last night looking like he'd been in a very large conversation." Ron ate a biscuit. "Malfoy saying you cheated at something and Snape saying nothing at all, which is somehow more alarming." "What are you saying?" Harry asked. "I'm saying I helped beat a magical chess set and I'm not talking about it because it's mine," Ron said with great dignity. "Hermione's in the library being aggressively studious, which is what she does when she's processing things." "And Neville?" Harry asked. Ron looked at him. "Why Neville?" "Just checking in on people," Harry said. "He had a harder year than anyone noticed." Ron was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll check on him," with the same simple tone he'd used in the chess room, no drama, just the identification of a thing that needed doing. Harry lay back against the hospital wing pillow. He thought about the year. About the first morning in September when he'd sat in an empty compartment reading a book and a boy with red hair had knocked on the door and asked to sit down. About the sorting and the hat and the thing it had said, "You want to matter to someone, and you want to be somewhere worth mattering to." About potions in Snape's face when Harry had sighted Alderton. About flying. About the room on the 7th floor and the mirror and the castle's slow geological warmth. About a Halloween night and a troll asleep on a bathroom floor and 2 people choosing to stay. He had done something significant last night. He knew that he had a clear-eyed relationship with what he was capable of, and he knew last night was significant. But the significant thing was not the most important thing. The most important thing was that he'd gone back to 2 people waiting by a fire. Madame Pomfrey discharged him mid-morning with instructions he was planning to mostly follow. He walked out of the hospital wing and into the corridor where Snape was standing. Harry stopped. Snape looked at him, not the theatrical Snape, not the sweeping entrance or the weighted silence. Just a man in a corridor looking at a boy who had been somewhere difficult and come back from it. "Your hand," Snape said. "Healed," Harry said. "The contact burned," Snape said. "From Quirrell, the residue of what was in him." "Yes." Snape was quiet for a moment. His arms were crossed and his expression was the one Harry had been cataloging all year, the photograph still developing, the reluctant conclusion, and underneath it the old wound that Dumbledore had confirmed was adjacent to his mother. "I owe you an explanation," Snape said, in the precise tone of a man who does not like owing things and is choosing to pay this particular debt because the alternative is worse. "You don't," Harry said. Snape looked at him sharply. "I worked out most of it," Harry said. "You knew something was wrong with Quirrell. You've been watching the situation. The potion's protection was as much to observe who tried it as to stop them." He paused. "You've been trying to keep me safe without admitting you were trying to keep me safe." Snape's expression went through several things in rapid succession. He settled on something that was not quite agreement and was not quite denial. "Your mother," he said, and the word had the quality of something very old and long carried. "She was important to you," Harry said. "The most important person I've known," Snape said in a voice stripped to bone. "And I failed her in ways I can't," he stopped. "I know," Harry said. Snape looked at him, the old wound right at the surface. "I'm not her," Harry said, "but I have her magic in me. Literally, Dumbledore told me, her protection is threaded into mine." He paused, thinking about what to offer because he had something to offer and it was his to give or not give. He chose to give it. "You haven't failed her. Everything you've done to keep that safe," he gestured toward his own forehead, toward the scar, toward the year and all its moving parts, "is the opposite of failing her." Snape looked at him for a very long time. "You are distressingly perceptive for an 11-year-old, he said finally. "I had a lot of time to practice paying attention," Harry said. Snape looked away. His jaw was tight. "The potion's mark for this year," he said, in the crisp, controlled tone of someone changing the subject because the previous one has reached its limit, "will reflect your actual ability rather than my previous assessment of it." "Which was," Harry said because he was curious. "Exceptional," Snape said like the word cost him something. "Infuriatingly so." He walked away without waiting for a response, robes moving with the architectural precision of someone who has spent decades making sure their exits look chosen. Harry watched him go. He thought, "That's a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time." He thought, "I know what that's like." He thought, "I'll be kind to him. Not because I owe it, because I can." The end-of-year feast was louder than anything Harry had attended, which was because Gryffindor won the House Cup by a margin that Dumbledore announced with the specific enjoyment of someone delivering news they've been looking forward to. There were house points awarded at dinner, 50 to Harry, 50 to Hermione, 50 to Ron, 10 to Neville for something Dumbledore called the hardest kind of bravery. And Neville's face went from confused to overwhelmed in about 3 seconds, and Ron clapped him on the back with the same practical warmth he gave everything. And Hermione started crying, which she immediately denied. Harry sat in the Great Hall at the Gryffindor table on the last night of his first year and looked at it all. The noise and the color and the faces. The enchanted ceiling going from blue to gold to the deep purple of a midsummer evening. The teachers at the high table, McGonagall quietly delighted, Dumbledore with his benevolent all-seeing expression, and that layer underneath it that Harry could read now. Snape not scowling, not smiling either, but not scowling, which was its own significant event. Malfoy across the hall, catching Harry's eye once and giving him a look that was too complicated for 11 years old, resentment and something reluctant underneath it that might eventually become, under the right circumstances, something else. Harry gave him a nod. Malfoy looked away, but not before the reluctant something had flickered slightly. The twins, Fred and George, doing something with dung bombs that McGonagall was choosing not to notice because she was looking in a very precise direction away from them. Neville, sitting next to Ron, carefully eating his pudding with the expression of someone who has survived a long year and is extremely glad to have pudding. Hermione, dried eyes composed, already making next year reading lists in her head. Harry could tell, could see the specific quality of the inward look. Ron, beside him, cheerfully eating everything on the table, and making a sound argument to anyone who would listen that the treacle tart was objectively the superior dessert, and the evidence supported this. Harry ate his treacle tart and thought about September. About stepping through the barrier at King's Cross into steam and magic and not knowing a single person or a single thing about what he was walking into. About choosing a compartment, about the boy who knocked, about the 7 years before September in the cupboard with his books and his magic and the golf ball light and the bird with the broken wing and the hamster and the biscuit. He thought, I have been becoming this for a long time. He thought it was worth it, all of it. The feast wound down. Students began to drift toward their dormitories. Harry stayed at the table a few minutes after most had left, finishing his pumpkin juice, and the great hall emptied slowly around him. Dumbledore caught his eye from the high table. Not a smile exactly, an acknowledgement, the look of someone who has made decisions about you and is reckoning with what those decisions have produced and finding the reckoning more complicated than the planning and sitting with that as something earned rather than something to be managed. Harry raised his cup slightly, a toast to no one in particular, to the year, to his mother's magic threaded through his, to a chess game and a bathroom floor and 2 people waiting by a fire. He drank and set down the cup and stood. He walked out of the great hall into the entrance hall, and the castle was around him, warm and vast and attentive, and he felt it the way he always had, the hand against the glass, the slow geological warmth, and thought it at the same thing he'd thought in the 3rd floor corridor after the fire went out and the cold thing left and the room was just a room. I'm here. The castle thought back. He went up the stairs toward the tower, toward the common room where Ron and Hermione were waiting, toward the summer and whatever came after the summer and whatever came after that, carrying what he'd always carried and something new alongside it. The weight of people he'd chosen and who had chosen him back, which was heavier than he'd expected and precisely as good.